I've always enjoyed being outdoors, far away from noise and crowds. The quiet of nature always made me feel calm. So when I had a long weekend off work, I decided to go camping alone. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just said I'd be gone for a few days. I packed my tent, sleeping bag, food, and everything else I'd need, and drove north toward the mountains. My plan was simple: hike deep into the forest, set up camp, and just stay there for a few nights. I reached the edge of the forest around noon. The parking lot was nearly empty, just one other car. The air was cold but clean, and the sky was clear. I strapped on my backpack and started walking along a narrow trail that went deep into the woods. The path was rocky at first, then turned to soft dirt covered in dry pine needles. I could hear my boots crunching with every step, and birds calling somewhere high in the trees. After a few hours of hiking, I stopped to rest by a small stream. The water was running fast, clean, and cold. I filled my bottle, ate a sandwich, and checked my map. The place I had marked for my campsite was still about 2 hours away. I didn't see anyone else on the trail, which was exactly what I wanted. When I finally reached the clearing, it was quiet except for the wind moving through the trees. The ground was flat, and there was a large fallen log that I could sit on near the fire. It seemed perfect. I set up my tent, unpacked my sleeping bag, gathered some wood, and got a small fire going before the sun went down. The light slowly faded behind the trees, and the air got colder fast. That first night, I sat by the fire for a long time. The woods were so still that I could hear the crackle of the fire and my own breathing. Occasionally, I'd hear something move in the distance, probably an animal, but I didn't think much of it. When the fire burned low, I crawled into my tent and zipped myself in. The ground was hard, but I was tired enough that it didn't matter. I woke up once during the night. It was completely dark outside, no moon at all, and everything was silent. For a few seconds, I just lay there listening. Then I heard something like a stick breaking. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Could have been anything. I tried to ignore it and fell asleep again. The next morning, I went exploring around the area. I walked toward the stream that ran through the forest about half a mile away. The air was crisp, and there was still dew on the grass. As I walked, I noticed something strange. A set of footprints in the mud, not far from my tent. They weren't mine. They were too large and looked fresher than they should have been. Maybe another camper had passed by, but I hadn't seen anyone since I arrived. I followed them for a short distance, but they disappeared into a patch of rocks. I shrugged it off. There were hunters around sometimes. It could have been one of them. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had walked near my camp during the night. I spent the rest of the day collecting wood, fishing a little, and trying to enjoy the quiet. The forest felt different though, like the silence was heavier. The wind barely moved, and I noticed fewer birds than before. Even the small sounds I made seemed too loud. I tried to convince myself that I was just overthinking it. That evening, I built another fire and cooked some food. The smell of smoke and roasted food filled the air, and for a while it felt peaceful again. As it got darker, I decided to sit a little farther from the tent, near the edge of the clearing, where I could look into the trees. The firelight flickered on the branches, and beyond that, everything was black. After a while, I started hearing small noises again. Twigs snapping, something brushing against leaves. I turned my head a few times, trying to spot what it was, but I couldn't see anything. Then I noticed something faint, a reflection, like light glinting off metal or glass. It was far away, maybe 50 yards into the trees. It appeared for a second and then disappeared. I thought it could have been an animal's eyes catching the firelight, but it didn't seem right. I decided to throw a few more logs on the fire to make it brighter. The flames grew, lighting up more of the area. I waited, staring into the dark, but nothing moved. I told myself it was fine and tried to focus on the fire. But that feeling that someone was watching didn't go away. When I finally went into the tent, I left the fire burning low outside. I zipped the flap and tried to sleep. I kept my flashlight near my hand, just in case. It took a long time to drift off. I woke up again sometime in the middle of the night. The fire had died out, and the forest was completely silent. I could hear my own heartbeat. Then, very faintly, I heard something that made me freeze. It was the sound of slow footsteps on dry leaves. They were careful, almost soft, but I could tell they were close. I stayed still, barely breathing. The steps came closer to the tent, stopped for a second, and then I heard something scrape lightly against the fabric. My chest tightened. I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the tent wall, trying to see if there was a shadow. There wasn't much light, just faint moonlight filtering through the trees. After a few seconds, the sound moved again, around the side of the tent this time. Then it faded into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, waiting for it to return, but it never did. When the sun came up, I got out of the tent fast. The air was cold, and the ground was damp. I walked around the clearing, looking for footprints. There were some deep ones around the tent, definitely from a person. I looked toward the direction they led, but they stopped near the trees. That was the first time I felt real fear. Someone had been walking around my tent while I was sleeping. I packed my bag right away. I thought about hiking back to the car, but it was a long walk and I wasn't sure I'd make it before dark. I decided to move camp closer to the main trail so I wouldn't be too isolated. I hiked for nearly 2 hours before finding another spot. It wasn't as open as the first one, but it was closer to the path. I set up again, but I couldn't relax. Every sound made me turn my head. I barely ate that day. I just wanted to get through one more night and leave early the next morning. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I stayed inside my tent with my flashlight off, listening. The forest was silent again. I tried to calm my breathing, but my heart wouldn't slow down. Around midnight, I started hearing something again. Faint, steady movement through the trees. This time it was slower, more deliberate. I could tell it was circling me. My whole body went tense. I gripped the flashlight but didn't turn it on. The sound came closer, then stopped. I didn't move. After what felt like minutes, I heard a short, quick breath, like someone exhaling close by. I finally turned on the light and pointed it at the tent wall. Nothing, just fabric. But when I crawled out slowly, shining the light around, I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the ground near the edge of the camp, there was a piece of torn fabric, dark, dirty, and covered in mud. It looked like part of an old jacket. Next to it was a small metal button that had been ripped off. I looked around with the light, scanning the trees, but there was nothing there. I stood completely still, listening, and after a moment I heard movement again. Fast, like someone running. It faded deeper into the woods. I backed toward my tent and stayed awake the rest of the night. My light pointed at the tree line. The first light, I packed up everything as fast as I could. My hands were shaking the whole time. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out. The trail felt longer than before, every step echoing through the quiet forest. I kept glancing behind me, convinced I'd see someone following. When I finally reached the parking lot, there were 2 forest rangers standing near their truck. I told them that someone had been near my camp at night, maybe following me. They exchanged looks and asked where exactly I had been. When I showed them the location on the map, one of them nodded slowly. He said that area had been closed off a few months back after reports of someone living deep in the woods. They hadn't found him yet, but several campers had mentioned hearing footsteps or finding things missing from their campsites. I didn't stay to hear more. I just got in my car and drove away. For days after that, I couldn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing those slow footsteps circling my tent. I realized how lucky I was that nothing worse happened. Now, I don't camp alone anymore. I still love the woods, but whenever I think about that trip, I remember the footprints around my tent, the sound of someone breathing just outside, and how close I might have been to something I never saw. The scariest part is knowing that whoever it was, they're probably still out there somewhere, waiting for the next person who decides to camp alone. I went camping alone last summer, deep in a forest I hadn't been to before. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend away from people and noise. I had been working nonstop for months and needed a break. I picked a random spot on the map, a patch of forest surrounded by a small lake and long dirt trails. It wasn't an official campsite, just a secluded clearing that people rarely visited. I thought that would make it perfect. I arrived late in the afternoon. The air was still warm, the kind of heavy air that feels thick when you breathe. The dirt road leading into the forest had been rough, filled with potholes and rocks that made my small SUV rattle the whole way. By the time I found a flat area to park, I was surrounded by trees so tall that the sunlight barely touched the ground. The forest was silent. No voices, no engines, not even birds at that hour. I set up my tent near the lake, about 50 feet from the water. The lake's surface was perfectly still, reflecting the tall pines and the faint orange sky. I could see small insects hovering above the water, and occasionally, a fish would ripple the surface. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost too perfect. After pitching the tent, I gathered firewood and set up a small fire pit. The smell of pine and damp soil mixed with the faint smoke as I cooked a simple meal, just canned beans and sausages. I remember thinking how quiet everything was. No planes, no distant traffic, just the faint creaking of trees as they swayed. As the sun went down, the forest changed. The colors faded, and shadows stretched longer between the trees. I could hear faint rustling, small animals moving through the brush. The air got cooler quickly, and the damp smell of the lake grew stronger. I lit my lantern and sat near the fire, watching the flames dance and pop. By nightfall, I felt uneasy, not scared, just aware. Every time I looked into the forest, the darkness seemed thicker, as if it absorbed my light instead of reflecting it. I tried to ignore the feeling and focused on the warmth of the fire. Around midnight, I decided to go to sleep. I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay in my sleeping bag listening to the faint sounds outside. Crickets, frogs, the occasional splash from the lake. But sometime during the night, I woke up suddenly. There was no sound, complete silence, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I lay there still, eyes open, trying to hear anything. Then I heard a faint crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. It came from somewhere near the edge of my campsite. I froze, listening. Another step, slow, careful, deliberate. It didn't sound like an animal. Animals scurry. They move fast and erratic. This was heavy, slow, and cautious, like someone trying not to make noise. I stayed completely still, heart pounding, barely breathing. The steps stopped. I waited for a full minute, but nothing moved. I slowly unzipped the sleeping bag and reached for my flashlight. The zipper sounded way louder than I wanted it to. I turned the flashlight on and pointed it toward the tent's thin fabric. No shadows, no movement. I thought maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the trees or a falling branch had made the sound. I lay back down, trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid. Then I heard the same sound again, closer this time, maybe 10 feet away from my tent. Another crunch, followed by a faint rustle. My chest tightened. I sat up, turned off the flashlight, and listened again. The steps were moving slowly around the tent, circling. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't want to move or make a sound. I thought maybe it was a deer or some large animal, but it sounded too controlled, too human. After what felt like minutes, the sound faded away into the trees. I waited longer, maybe half an hour, before I finally let myself relax. Eventually, I fell asleep again, though it was a restless sleep filled with half-dreams and panic. When I woke up in the morning, sunlight was shining through the tent. The air was crisp and cold. I stepped out and looked around. Everything seemed normal. The fire pit had gone cold. My cooler and supplies were untouched. But then I noticed the ground near the edge of my campsite. There were footprints. Not shoe prints, just deep impressions that looked like bare feet. The soil was soft from the moisture near the lake, so the prints were clear, long toes, narrow heels. They circled around the tent, then disappeared into the forest. I stood there for a long time staring at them. I don't know how I missed hearing more of it last night. The idea that someone, barefoot, had been walking around my tent while I was sleeping made my skin crawl. I packed my things quickly, deciding to leave. But as I was rolling up the tent, I noticed something else. Near the fire pit, Someone had placed 3 small rocks in a triangle pattern. I was certain I hadn't done that. It wasn't random, they were neatly arranged. That bothered me more than anything else. Someone had been there, close enough to touch my things, and I hadn't noticed. Still, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe kids had come by, maybe it was some local hiker's joke. I told myself that over and over as I drove out of the forest. But even after I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. A week later, I went through the photos on my phone from the trip. Most were normal pictures of the lake, the trees, the campfire, but one picture stopped me cold. It was a shot I had taken of the lake at sunset, right before going to sleep. In the far right corner of the frame, half hidden behind a tree, was a shape. A person standing still, watching from the shadows. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a tree stump. But when I zoomed in, I could see the faint outline of a shoulder, a face partly visible, the empty space where eyes should have caught some reflection. I deleted the picture immediately, but it didn't matter. I couldn't forget it. That night, I dreamed I was back there. The same forest, the same tent, the same silence. Only this time, when I woke up in the dream, someone was standing right outside the tent, breathing softly, their shadow stretching across the fabric. I woke up drenched in sweat. After that, I stopped camping alone. For a while, I avoided even driving through wooded areas. But curiosity, or maybe something else, made me go back to check that place again a month later. I told myself I just wanted closure, to see if it was really as creepy as I remembered. When I reached the same spot, I noticed the dirt road looked more worn out, like vehicles had been using it recently. But when I got to where I had camped, I found something that froze me. Someone else had been there recently. There were remains of a small campfire, ashes still faintly gray, and pieces of rope tied around trees. It didn't look like a normal camp. It looked more like someone had been staying there long term. There were empty food cans, a torn sleeping bag, and a small metal pot. The strange part was that everything seemed placed neatly, almost obsessively tidy. And near the same tree where I had seen the shape in my photo, there were carvings. Long, straight lines cut deep into the bark, overlapping each other like tally marks. Dozens of them going up the trunk. I didn't stay long. As soon as I noticed that, I got back in my car and left. The whole drive out of that forest felt like being watched. Even now, months later, I still can't stop thinking about those barefoot prints circling my tent, the rocks in that perfect triangle, and that blurry shape in my photo. Whoever it was, whoever had been out there that night, they weren't just passing through. Sometimes when I drive home from work late at night, I see headlights flicker in my rearview mirror. A car follows for a few miles, then disappears when I turn off the main road. It's probably nothing, but every time I park, I check my driveway twice. And every single time I close my eyes, I still picture that silent forest and the faint sound of slow, careful footsteps moving in circles just outside the tent. I had been planning that camping trip for weeks. It wasn't something fancy or far away. Just a few days in a quiet forest area a few hours outside of town. I wanted to get away from screens, noise, and people. I'd been feeling mentally burned out from work, and camping alone sounded peaceful. I found a spot online that wasn't an official campsite but looked open and safe, surrounded by thick pine trees with a small river nearby. Felt perfect. I packed everything carefully: my tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, flashlight, extra batteries, water filter, a knife, some clothes, and a small first aid kit. I even checked the weather a few times to be sure there'd be no storms. Everything seemed fine. I left early on a Friday morning, hoping to set up camp before the afternoon sun hit too hard. The drive was calm at first. Once I left the main highway, the road became narrower and rougher. I drove for another hour through winding dirt roads lined with tall trees that created a canopy over my car. The forest smelled strong. Fresh pine, wet earth, and something else I couldn't quite place. I felt excited but uneasy at the same time. When I reached the spot I'd chosen, it was better than the pictures. There was a small clearing by the river, surrounded by dense trees on all sides. The air was cool, and I could hear the soft running water nearby. I parked my car beside a fallen log, unloaded my gear, and started setting up my tent. The first few hours were peaceful. I built a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and just sat by the river, letting my thoughts slow down. It felt like the kind of quiet you don't get anywhere else. No traffic, no phones, just wind through the trees and the occasional bird sound. I took a short walk deeper into the woods before sunset, marking my way with sticks and small stones just to be safe. When night came, everything changed. The forest that had felt calm now felt heavy. Every sound became sharper. I could hear the crackling of the fire, the occasional splash of water, and the wind brushing through the branches. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I got into my tent, zipped it up, and lay down, listening to the faint hum of nature. Sometime around midnight, I woke up to the sound of crunching leaves. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the steps sounded too steady, too slow, like someone walking carefully. I froze, barely breathing. The steps came closer, then stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. After a few seconds, I heard something brush against the side of my tent. It wasn't rough, just a slow drag, like someone running a hand across the fabric. I stayed still for a long time. The sound eventually stopped, and I told myself it must have been a deer or maybe a branch that fell. I managed to fall asleep again, but not deeply. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and saw something strange. Around my camp, the ground had new footprints. They weren't from boots or shoes, they looked like bare feet. The size seemed adult, not a child's. I crouched to check, thinking maybe I'd made them last night somehow, but they led from the trees to my tent and then back out toward the woods. Felt wrong, but I tried not to panic. I told myself maybe someone else was camping nearby, and they just wandered through. Still, the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. I spent the day trying to relax, fishing by the river, cooking some food, but I kept glancing into the tree line every few minutes. By evening, I decided to set up a small perimeter, just a few tin cans tied to a string near my tent, a trick I'd seen online to alert campers if anything came close. I wasn't really expecting anything, but it made me feel better. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing faint movements, soft snaps of twigs, and distant rustling. Around 2 a.m., one of the cans rattled. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent slowly, and shined it outside. Nothing moved. The forest looked still, but I noticed something by the edge of the trees, a shape just barely visible. It looked like a person standing between the trees. I couldn't make out details, only a dark outline. The light hit the figure for a second, then it stepped back, vanishing into the darkness. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I waited for a long time, flashlight shaking in my hand, but nothing else happened. At dawn, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up quickly, stuffing everything into the car. Before leaving, I walked to where I'd seen the figure. There were more footprints, still bare, leading further into the forest. I followed them for a short distance until they disappeared near a patch of moss and roots. The ground there was disturbed, like something had been dragged or buried. I wanted to look closer, but the feeling in my gut told me not to. I went back to my car and drove off. The drive back felt longer. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over to catch my breath. I noticed something on my car's window then, a handprint, a clear, dusty print of a bare hand. It was on the outside, near the back door. I tried to tell myself it might have been from when I was loading my stuff, but the shape didn't match mine. It was longer, thinner. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I checked local news and found a small article about hikers who'd gone missing in that same area years ago. They'd never been found. The place was unofficial for a reason. Apparently, there were reports of strange incidents there, but nothing ever proven. Weeks passed, but sometimes at night, I still think about that sound. The slow, dragging movement against my tent. The feeling of someone just outside, waiting. Even now, when I go camping with friends, I keep waking up in the middle of the night, listening for those same careful steps. And sometimes, when I do, I swear I can still smell that faint mix of pine and wet earth, just like that night. It's been months, but I haven't gone back. I don't plan to. Some places aren't meant for camping alone. Not because of ghosts or legends, but because you never really know who else might be living out there, just beyond the trees, watching. Every time I think about it, I realize how close I was to something or someone I'll never understand. I was lucky to leave that place when I did. But the one thing that still keeps me awake sometimes isn't what I saw. It's wondering what would have happened if I hadn't woken up when I did that night. I went camping alone that weekend because I needed to clear my head. Work had been stressful, and I hadn't taken a real break in months. I picked a quiet spot deep in the mountains, far from the popular campgrounds where families and groups usually gathered. I wanted silence, the kind that only existed where there was no phone signal, no traffic, no people. Just the forest, the wind, and the sound of my own breathing. The drive there took nearly 5 hours. The last stretch of road turned into a narrow dirt path filled with potholes, mud, and fallen branches. My car bounced and rattled as I made my way deeper into the trees. The forest around me looked wild and untouched. The trees were tall and close together, their thick branches blocking much of the sunlight. The air was cool, heavy with the smell of pine and damp soil. By the time I found a decent clearing, it was late afternoon. The sun was starting to dip, and everything around me had that golden orange glow that made the forest look peaceful. I parked the car near a cluster of rocks and unloaded my gear, tent, sleeping bag, cooler, and a small camping stove. I had brought enough supplies for 3 days. Canned food, water, and some snacks. Setting up the tent took longer than I expected. The ground was uneven and covered in roots. Every time I hammered in a stake, it hit a rock or something solid underneath. But after nearly an hour, I finally had my small green tent standing. I gathered some wood for a fire, cooked a can of beans on the stove, and sat down on a folding chair as the forest slowly grew darker around me. The silence hit differently once the sun went down. During the day, you could hear birds, insects, and the rustling of small animals in the brush. But at night, the forest became still, almost too still. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fire and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere in the distance. Every time I looked up, the stars seemed sharper, brighter, like they were hanging closer than usual. I tried to relax, but a strange feeling crept over me. It wasn't fear, at least not yet. It was more like an awareness that I was truly alone. I had no cell service, no way to call anyone, and no one knew exactly where I was. If anything happened out here, it would just be me. That thought sat in the back of my mind like a quiet warning. I went to sleep early that night, but it took me a long time to actually drift off. The ground was cold, and every sound outside the tent felt amplified. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. There was no loud noise, no movement, but something had changed. The forest outside was completely silent. Even the crickets had stopped. I listened for a long time, lying perfectly still, and then I heard it. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It moved slowly, pausing every few seconds. My heart started racing. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe, but the rhythm of the steps was too steady, too careful. Animals don't usually walk like that. I stayed in my sleeping bag, staring at the thin nylon wall of the tent, waiting for it to pass. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. I waited another 10 minutes before daring to unzip the tent a little. The air outside was freezing, and the fire had burned down to faint red embers. I shined my flashlight toward the trees but saw nothing. Just shadows, branches, and fog creeping low across the ground. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept imagining someone standing just beyond the light, watching me. The next morning, I found fresh footprints near the edge of my campsite. They were human, no doubt about it. Barefoot, slightly larger than my own size. The ground was soft from the rain earlier in the week, so the prints were clear. I crouched down and stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. They came from the trees and stopped just a few feet from where my tent had been. That uneasy feeling from last night grew stronger. I told myself it could have been some hiker passing through, but the idea didn't sit right. No one hikes barefoot through that kind of terrain. It was filled with rocks, sticks, and thorny plants. I packed my things and decided to move deeper into the forest, just to put some distance between myself and whatever that was. I didn't want to abandon the trip completely, but I wanted to be somewhere less exposed. I hiked for about an hour before finding another clearing near a stream. The sound of running water made it feel less lonely. I set up camp again, made a small fire, and tried to shake off the nerves. The rest of the day passed quietly. I fished in the stream, ate lunch sitting on a rock, and even took a short nap in my chair. But as soon as the sun began to drop, that same tight feeling in my chest returned. The forest looked different at dusk, colder, darker, more claustrophobic. When night came, I kept the fire burning higher than usual. I sat there watching it, trying to ignore every sound. Around 10 p.m., I heard movement again. This time, it wasn't footsteps, it was something dragging. A slow, scraping sound, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. My heart thumped hard in my chest. I pointed my flashlight toward the sound, but the light hit only trees and thick fog. The dragging sound stopped. Then there was silence. Long, unbearable silence. A few seconds later, a loud crack echoed from the direction of the stream. It sounded like a branch snapping under weight. I froze. I didn't want to move, didn't want to make a sound. I sat completely still, listening, until I realized I was holding my breath. Then, from the edge of the trees, I saw a faint glimmer, like light reflecting off metal. It disappeared almost instantly, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. I decided to leave. I didn't care how late it was. I packed what I could into my backpack, grabbed my flashlight, and started walking back toward the dirt road where I'd parked earlier. I left the rest of my gear behind. The forest was pitch black, and the narrow trail was hard to follow. My flashlight kept flickering, and every few steps, I thought I heard something behind me. The sound came again, the dragging noise, faint but steady. It seemed to follow me, matching my pace. When I stopped, it stopped. When I moved, it moved. I forced myself to keep walking, trying to ignore the sweat running down my back despite the cold. The trail eventually widened, and I saw the faint outline of my car in the distance. Relief hit me so hard I nearly ran the last few steps. I jumped inside, slammed the doors shut, and locked them. My hands were shaking as I turned the key, but the engine hesitated before finally starting. As I turned on the headlights, they lit up the trees in front of me, and that's when I saw it. Something was standing just inside the tree line. It wasn't an animal. It was a man. His clothes were torn and dirty, his face shadowed by his hair. He was barefoot, and in his right hand he was holding something long. A piece of metal, maybe a crowbar or a broken tool. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring straight at me through the glare of the headlights. I didn't wait to see anything else. I hit the gas and sped down the dirt path, the car bouncing over every bump and rock. My eyes stayed glued to the rearview mirror until the forest was gone. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over, shaking so badly I could barely breathe. I sat there for almost 20 minutes before driving again. I didn't stop until I reached a small town, where I parked near a gas station and waited until sunrise. The next morning, I told myself I'd go back with someone, maybe a ranger, to get my things. But when I returned a few days later with a friend, everything was gone. My tent, chair, stove, everything. The clearing looked empty, as if no one had ever camped there. The only thing left was a pile of ashes where the fire had been. I never went camping alone again after that. Even now, years later, I still remember that man's face, or at least the shadow of it. Every time I think about it, I wonder how long he had been there before I noticed. Maybe he had been watching me the whole time, moving closer each night. Maybe those footsteps the first night weren't the beginning, but the end of something that had started long before I even arrived. And the worst part is, I'll never know. I had been looking forward to that camping trip for weeks. I wanted to get away from noise, traffic, and people. Life in the city had started to drain me, and I needed silence. Just me, a tent, and nature. I picked a spot deep in a forest about 4 hours from my place, a quiet area near a small lake. It wasn't a marked campground. I found it while scrolling through old hiking blogs. It was supposed to be peaceful and rarely visited. That was exactly what I wanted. I started packing 2 days earlier: tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, knife, dry food, a small stove, some water bottles, and my old backpack. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, only that I'd be camping for a few days. That didn't seem like a big deal at the time. The morning I left, the weather was perfect. The sky was clear, the air crisp. I drove until the road narrowed into gravel, then parked my car beside a clearing and started hiking with my gear. The trail was quiet except for the crunch of my boots and the sound of distant birds. I followed a narrow dirt path that wound between thick trees, with sunlight breaking through the leaves in thin golden lines. After a couple of hours, I reached the lake. It was calm, with still water reflecting the trees around it. I found a small patch of flat ground near the edge, where the view was open. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and felt completely at peace. The first day went smoothly. I spent the afternoon exploring around, walking through the forest, and taking photos. There were animal tracks near the shore, probably deer. The air smelled clean, and the only sound was the gentle rustle of leaves. I made some instant noodles for dinner, sat by the fire, and watched the sky turn orange, then deep blue. By night, I was tired but happy. The stars above the lake were so clear they almost looked fake. When I finally lay down inside my tent, I could hear crickets and the soft splash of fish jumping in the water. It was perfect, but around midnight, something woke me up. It was faint at first, like a soft snapping sound. I thought it was a branch falling, but then I heard it again. Something was moving outside. I lay still, listening. The sound was slow, almost cautious, like footsteps on dried leaves. I held my breath and waited, trying to make sense of it. After a few seconds, it stopped. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon. I told myself that and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I woke up with sunlight filtering through the tent fabric. I stepped outside, stretched, and walked around. Everything looked normal, except I noticed something strange in the dirt near the tent. Prints. Not clear ones, but too large and uneven to be a small animal. They weren't shoe prints either. It looked like someone had stepped there barefoot, dragging a little with each step. The soil near the trees showed a few more, leading toward the woods. For a minute, I just stood there staring. It was odd, but I tried not to think too much about it. Maybe someone had been hiking nearby. Still, something about the pattern felt wrong. The rest of the day went quietly. I fished for a while, cooked, and read a book I brought. By late afternoon, the forest felt thicker, the air heavier. It wasn't windy, but the trees were swaying slightly, making soft creaks. As the sun set, I built another fire. I noticed a few more branches broken near the edge of my camp. It made me uneasy. I decided to stay close to the tent and keep the fire going longer. That night, I couldn't fall asleep easily. The forest was silent in a strange way. The usual insects and frogs seemed quieter. Around 1 a.m., I heard it again, the same slow, dragging movement in the leaves. This time it was closer, just beyond the firelight. I sat up, my heart pounding. I reached for my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. For a moment, I thought I saw something, just a brief flicker of movement between the trees. It looked like someone crouched low, but by the time I focused, it was gone. I called out, but no answer came. I stood still, scanning the trees with the light, but there was nothing. Eventually, I put more wood on the fire and stayed up for hours, watching the dark tree line. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I walked around again, checking the ground. The footprints were clearer now. They went around my tent and back toward the woods, as if someone had circled my campsite. I felt a deep unease settle in my stomach. There was no one else for miles, at least none that I knew of. By the third day, I decided I'd had enough. I wanted to leave early the next morning. I packed some of my things but stayed one more night since it was already late. That evening, I made my fire a little bigger. I didn't wander far at all. When the forest got dark, I noticed something new. A faint metallic glint among the trees when the fire flickered. I thought maybe it was a can or bottle left behind. But when I went closer, I realized it was something else. A thin piece of wire hung between two trees, about waist high. It looked deliberate, like someone had tied it there. That's when it hit me. This wasn't random. Someone had been moving through the area, watching. Maybe they had set up traps or markings. My stomach turned cold. I backed up slowly and decided not to stay another night. I threw water on the fire, packed my essentials, and started walking back toward my car even though it was dark. The forest at night was completely different. Every sound echoed. My flashlight cut through the blackness in a narrow beam. I tried to stay calm, but I kept hearing something behind me. A steady, soft sound matching my pace, like someone walking when I walked and stopping when I stopped. I turned around a few times, shining the light into the trees, but there was nothing. The feeling of being followed grew stronger with every step. My backpack straps dug into my shoulders. My hands were shaking, but I didn't stop. After maybe an hour, I finally reached the gravel road where I had parked. My car was there, covered lightly in dust. But when I got closer, I froze. The driver's door was open. I hadn't left it like that. My keys were still in my pocket. I hadn't been near the car since I parked it. I stood there, staring at the open door, unable to move. The inside looked untouched at first, but when I leaned closer, I saw footprints on the ground near the door. The same barefoot marks I'd seen near my tent. Panic took over. I got inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely fit the key into the ignition. I turned the headlights on, and in that beam of light, for just a split second, I saw a figure standing far down the road. They were barely visible through the trees, motionless, watching. I drove off so fast that the car jolted on the rough ground. I didn't look back again. Even after I reached the main road, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror. There was nothing there, but my chest wouldn't stop tightening. I didn't stop until I got home, long after sunrise. For days afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. I kept thinking about that wire in the woods, the prints, and the open car door. I went through the photos I took on the first day and noticed something I hadn't seen before. In one of the shots of the lake, there was a faint shape near the trees across the water. A dark silhouette, almost hidden in the shadows. It had been there even before the first night. I reported it to the local ranger's office later that week. They said that part of the forest wasn't an official camping zone and that a few hikers had reported strange things. Missing gear, broken branches, sounds of movement at night. They suspected someone had been living there illegally, surviving off what others left behind. That thought stayed with me for a long time. I realized I had probably camped right in the middle of someone's hidden area, maybe near their shelter, without knowing. They hadn't tried to talk or attack. They just watched, maybe waiting for me to leave. Now, whenever I think about camping alone again, I remember that feeling of being watched, that quiet movement in the leaves, and that open car door. I still love nature, but I never camp alone anymore. I always make sure I'm in a marked campground, surrounded by people, because somewhere out there, deep in those woods, someone is still living unseen, watching anyone who wanders too far in. I always liked camping alone. It gave me a sense of control, of quiet that city life could never offer. I used to drive deep into forests, miles from anyone, set up my small tent, and just disappear for a few days. No phones, no voices, no lights except the stars. I thought I understood nature, but last summer, during a solo trip in Montana, I learned that nature doesn't care about your comfort. It doesn't care whether you're scared or confident. It just is. I reached the forest around noon after a 5-hour drive through empty highways and dirt roads. The place wasn't an official campground, just a clearing I'd found on Google Earth and marked on my GPS months earlier. The track leading there was rough. Muddy patches, loose gravel, sharp turns, but I managed to get my truck through. When I stepped out, I could smell wet pine and hear nothing but the faint rush of wind through the trees. No cars, no people, no signs of anyone. It was perfect. The clearing sat between tall pines that looked hundreds of years old. The ground was soft, covered in a thick layer of dry needles. I parked the truck near a fallen log and unloaded my gear, tent, sleeping bag, a small gas stove, and enough food for 3 days. I pitched my tent near the edge of the clearing where the ground sloped gently toward a small stream. The sound of water was faint but constant, a soothing background noise that made the place feel alive. By evening, the forest changed color. The sunlight turned gold, then orange, then faded into long shadows that crept between the trees. I gathered some firewood before it got too dark, stacking dry branches beside a small pit I dug earlier. When the fire finally caught, the flames flickered against the trunks around me, painting them in shades of red and black. I ate a quick meal, beans and bread, and leaned back on my camping chair. It was peaceful, the kind of silence that makes you feel small but safe at the same time. Then I heard something, a faint snapping sound from somewhere deep in the trees. It wasn't close, just a branch breaking, maybe a deer moving through. I brushed it off easily. Animals roam everywhere out here, but I noticed something strange when I looked up. The woods behind my tent seemed darker than before, not just because of the fading light, but like the fire couldn't reach that part. The air felt thicker in that direction, the shadows heavier. I tried to shake it off, blaming the long drive and tiredness. As the night deepened, the fire burned low. The moon was out, pale and full, but half hidden by clouds. I decided to walk a bit toward the stream to refill my bottle before turning in. The ground was uneven, soft underfoot, and the beam from my flashlight jumped across the trees. I found the stream easily. It shimmered faintly under the moonlight, water flowing fast and clear. I crouched to fill the bottle and noticed footprints near the edge. They looked fresh, not animal prints, human ones. Bare feet, pressed deep into the mud, toes splayed slightly like someone had stood there a long time. I froze, staring at them. The prints were smaller than mine, maybe a woman's or a teenager's, but what got me was that they led out of the water, not into it. They came straight from the stream onto dry land and stopped a few feet away. No continuation, no return path, just ended abruptly. I stood up slowly, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. Nothing moved, but that heavy silence had returned, pressing down around me. The air felt colder suddenly. I backed away, bottle half filled, and made my way to camp, my pulse thudding in my ears. I told myself there must be a reason. Someone had passed by earlier, maybe crossed the stream barefoot. Still, something about the clean edges of the prints bothered me. They hadn't been smudged or softened by time. They were recent. I threw extra logs on the fire and sat closer to it than before. Around midnight, I woke up inside my tent, drenched in sweat despite the cold. The sound that woke me wasn't loud, just a faint rustling outside, slow and irregular. Could have been the wind, but it didn't match the rhythm. It was more like something brushing against the fabric of my tent. I held my breath and listened. The sound came again, soft, deliberate, like fingertips running along the side of the tent wall. My heart raced. I reached for my flashlight and switched it on. The beam cut through the thin nylon, making the tent glow faintly. I didn't see any shadow outside, just the movement of branches swaying above. I waited, but the sound stopped completely. I sat there for what felt like an hour, not daring to move, then finally lay down again, keeping the light on beside me. When morning came, I stepped out cautiously. The forest looked normal again. Sunlight filtered through the pines, birds chirped faintly, but something wasn't right. There were marks in the dirt around my tent. Not footprints this time, but long drag lines, as if someone had circled the tent with a stick or their hand. I counted 3 full circles, one overlapping the other, all uneven. I stared at them for a long time before deciding not to stay another night. I started packing up, trying to convince myself it was probably animals or even my own movements while half asleep. But as I loaded the gear into the truck, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My cooler was open and some food was missing, not torn apart like an animal would do, but carefully taken. The lid was placed beside it. My extra flashlight was gone too. I scanned the forest, feeling eyes on me though I couldn't see anyone. The wind picked up slightly, carrying a smell of damp soil and something else. Something sour like old sweat. I climbed into the truck, started the engine, and drove out as fast as I could. But the forest road was rough, and halfway through, I hit a deep rut that jolted the truck violently. When I got out to check, I saw it, the missing flashlight, lying right in the middle of the road. It was mine, no doubt about it. Same model, same worn grip. It wasn't there when I came in. I picked it up carefully, and it was warm, recently handled. I dropped it immediately, climbed back in, and didn't stop until I reached the main road miles away. Even after I got home, that trip stayed with me. I couldn't sleep properly for weeks. Every small sound at night felt like that rustling outside my tent. A month later, I tried to put it out of my mind and looked through the photos I'd taken during the trip. Most were normal, trees, the stream, my campfire, but the last one froze me. It was taken around sunset, before I'd even noticed the footprints. In the far background, between two trees, there was a shape tall, thin, blurred but human. It stood there, facing the camera, just far enough to look like part of the woods. I zoomed in and my stomach turned. It was a person, barefoot, wearing something dark that blended with the shadows. The face was slightly turned, but you could see a pale cheek, maybe a mouth. Whoever it was had been there before I even realized anyone else existed. I stopped camping alone after that. I sold my tent, my gear, everything. But sometimes, when I drive late at night through quiet roads surrounded by trees, I still feel it. That same pressure in the air, that same sense that something is watching. And once, months later, when I pulled over to rest at a small gas station off the highway, I saw it again. On the side of the pump, someone had left a single muddy footprint. Bare, small, and perfectly clear. I went camping alone for the first time last summer. It wasn't something I planned out for weeks. It just happened because I needed a break from people, noise, and my own head. I had been working long hours at a repair shop, sleeping badly, and spending too much time on my phone. One Friday morning, I packed my old backpack, tossed in my tent, some food, a small cooler, a sleeping bag, and drove north until the towns thinned out. My plan was simple: find a quiet spot near a lake, camp for a couple of nights, and clear my head. By the time I reached the edge of the state forest, the sun was hanging low and orange over the trees. The air smelled like pine and dirt, that kind of smell that reminds you how far away you are from the city. The dirt road leading into the forest was narrow and full of potholes, but my car made it through. I parked near a faded sign that said, Creek Ridge Trail, 3 miles to lake. I figured 3 miles wasn't bad, so I strapped on my backpack, slung my tent over my shoulder, and started walking. The trail was quiet. The sound of birds faded as I moved deeper into the woods. I could hear my boots crunching over leaves, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, and the faint rush of wind through the trees. Every now and then, a fly would buzz near my face, and I'd wave it away. After maybe an hour and a half, I found a clearing about 50 yards from the lake. The water was still, reflecting the sky like glass. There were no other tents, no footprints, no signs anyone had camped there recently. It was perfect. I set up my tent near a cluster of birch trees. I gathered some dry wood for a small fire, filled my bottle from the lake, and sat on a log to rest. As the sun dropped lower, the air cooled fast. Mosquitoes started to appear, so I lit the fire and opened a can of beans for dinner. The fire crackled, sending thin streams of smoke upward. I watched the light fade, the forest slowly darken, and the sounds shift from chirping birds to croaking frogs and buzzing insects. For a long time, it was peaceful, exactly what I wanted. When night came fully, I lay inside my tent, zipped in my sleeping bag, listening to the forest. The quiet wasn't complete. There were soft rustles, distant splashes from the lake, maybe a fish jumping or something small moving near the shore. I drifted in and out of sleep. Sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly. Couldn't say why. My eyes opened, and I felt that strange kind of alertness where you know something's off before you even process what. I lay still, my heart already picking up speed. Outside the tent, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching on dry leaves. At first, I thought maybe it was a deer, but the steps were too steady, too evenly spaced. I froze, barely breathing. The steps came closer, stopped, then started again, circling around my tent. I could hear them on the side near the lake, then behind me, then near the trees. I didn't move. I just listened. After maybe a full minute, they faded away into the distance. I waited another 10, maybe 15 minutes before I let myself relax again. Eventually, I fell asleep, telling myself it was probably just an animal. The next morning, I found fresh footprints near the edge of my camp. They weren't mine. These were smaller, narrower, like someone had been walking barefoot. I crouched down, touching the soil, trying to make sense of it. They led from the woods toward my tent and then veered off toward the lake. I looked around for any sign of another camper, but there was nothing. No gear, no fire pit, no sound of anyone nearby. It was eerie, but I told myself maybe a hiker had passed through at night. Still, it stayed in the back of my mind all morning. I decided to stay another night anyway. I had come this far, and leaving now felt like giving in to my own nerves. I spent the day fishing at the lake, cooking a small lunch, and exploring further down the trail. The weather was clear, the lake calm. By afternoon, I had started to feel normal again. I even convinced myself that the prints could have been mine from the night before. I might have walked barefoot briefly near the tent without realizing it. I knew that wasn't true, but I wanted it to be. As evening came, I gathered more firewood. I stacked it neatly beside my tent and watched the light fade over the lake. The forest always changed around dusk. The air grew thicker, heavier, and every small noise seemed sharper. I ate quietly, watching the reflection of the moon ripple on the surface of the water. I kept the fire burning longer this time, the flames throwing light across the clearing. When I finally crawled into my tent, I zipped the flap tighter than before. I woke again in the middle of the night, not from a noise this time, but from cold air brushing my face. The flap of the tent was slightly open. I was sure I had closed it. I sat up quickly, heart racing, staring into the darkness beyond the half-open zipper. My flashlight was beside me. I grabbed it, clicked it on, and shined it outside. The beam caught the trees, the edge of the lake, the fire pit. Everything looked the same. I stepped out slowly, my breath visible in the cool air. That's when I saw them again. Those same barefoot prints, fresh in the damp dirt, circling my tent. They hadn't been there before I went to sleep. Something in me shifted then. The peace I'd come for was gone. I wasn't scared in a movie kind of way. It was deeper than that, a physical fear, the kind that makes your chest tighten and your mind go blank except for the thought of leaving. I packed what I could in the dark, shoving my sleeping bag and food into my backpack. I didn't even bother folding the tent. I just collapsed it halfway, threw my gear together, and started down the trail with my flashlight shaking in my hand. The woods were silent, too silent. No crickets, no frogs, nothing but the crunch of my own steps. The beam of light cut through the trees, but everything beyond it was black. I moved fast, checking behind me every few seconds. Once I thought I heard something, a soft snap of a branch off to the left, but when I aimed my flashlight, there was nothing there. I kept walking, every muscle in my body tense. The path twisted, the trees all looking the same. I couldn't tell if I was still on the right trail. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. A tree ahead of me had my red bandana tied to one of its branches. I had tied that bandana near my tent earlier that day to mark where I'd hung my trash bag. I was certain of it, which meant somehow I had circled back to the same area. I looked around, breathing hard, the realization hitting me that I wasn't getting closer to the road. I was going in circles. I turned my flashlight off and crouched down, listening. The air was cold and heavy. I could hear something faint now, a distant crunch of leaves, slow and careful, coming from the direction of the lake. I didn't move. I stayed there, counting my breaths, hoping whoever or whatever it was would keep going. The sound grew louder, closer, until I could hear it maybe 30 feet away. I stayed as still as I could, crouched behind a fallen log. After what felt like forever, it stopped again. Silence. Minutes passed. Then I heard a splash in the lake. Not a big one, just enough to break the surface. Then another, like someone walking into the water. I never turned to look. I just waited until the sounds faded again, then stood up and walked fast, this time in the opposite direction of where I thought the lake was. My flashlight's beam caught bits of trail markers and I followed them. After maybe another hour, the trees began to thin. I recognized the old dirt road where my car was parked. When I reached it, I didn't stop to rest. I unlocked the car, threw everything inside, and sat for a minute before starting the engine. My hands were shaking so bad that I dropped the keys twice. The moment the headlights came on, I felt a rush of relief, but as the beams lit the edge of the woods, I saw something at the tree line, a figure standing there. It wasn't moving, just standing, watching. I couldn't see the face or the clothes clearly. It was too dark. I slammed the door shut and drove away, faster than I should have on that rough road. I didn't look back again. When I finally reached the highway, the morning light was starting to show. I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a long time, trying to slow my breathing. I checked my backpack, my cooler, everything I'd brought. That's when I noticed something odd. My spare flashlight, the one I hadn't used, was gone. It had been in the side pocket of my bag when I left home. I didn't drop it. I hadn't even taken it out at the campsite. It was just missing. I didn't report anything. What would I have said? Someone walked around my tent barefoot at night? No one would care. But I haven't gone camping alone since then. I tried once, a few months later, to plan another trip, but every time I think about being alone in the dark with only a thin layer of fabric between me and whatever's outside, I change my mind. Sometimes, though, I still think about those footprints. They weren't deep enough to belong to a grown man, but not small enough to be a kid's either. They were spaced too evenly to be wandering or random. They looked like some... I went camping alone last summer. I had done solo camping before, but this time I decided to go somewhere I had never been. A quiet, lesser-known forest about 3 hours away from home. It wasn't one of those popular camping spots with clear trails and marked campsites. This place was more remote, barely mentioned on any travel blogs, and that's exactly what I wanted. I was looking for silence, a place where I wouldn't hear cars, people, or anything except nature itself. I left early in the morning. My car was packed with all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, first aid kit, food, extra clothes, flashlight, knife, rope, water, and a small camping stove. I had checked everything twice before leaving. The drive was long and empty, long stretches of road with dense trees on both sides. After about 2 hours, the paved road turned into gravel. I followed it until it narrowed to a dirt path. Eventually, I reached a small wooden sign half hidden by bushes that read Miller Woods. I parked near a clearing, locked the car, and began walking into the forest. The air smelled of pine and wet earth. The sound of my boots crunching on dry leaves was the only noise for a long while. I followed what looked like an old trail, though it was hard to tell if it was actually a path or just a flattened area from old hikers. My phone showed 1 bar of signal, sometimes none. I took a photo of the coordinates before losing service completely, just in case. After about an hour of walking, I found a flat area surrounded by tall trees with thick trunks. It felt like the right place to set up camp. Far from any main path, quiet, shaded, and hidden enough that nobody could stumble upon it by accident. I unpacked my tent, spread out the tarp, and set everything up carefully. Took around 40 minutes to finish. I then collected dry wood, cleared a small circle for a campfire, and got everything ready for later. By afternoon, I had finished setting up and sat on a rock to eat a sandwich. The forest was calm. No distant voices, no airplanes, not even the usual faint highway noise you get in some remote areas. Only wind and occasional birds. But as I sat there, I noticed something strange. Every few minutes, I'd hear a faint crack of branches deeper in the forest. It wasn't constant, but it was there. I tried to tell myself it was probably deer or some animal moving around. Still, every time the sound came, I'd pause and listen carefully. Then it would stop. I decided to explore before it got dark. I grabbed my backpack, knife, and flashlight and started walking in a random direction. I didn't go too far, maybe half a mile, just enough to look around and memorize landmarks. The trees were tall and close together, the ground covered in leaves and roots that made walking a bit tricky. At one point, I came across what looked like the remains of an old cabin. Just a few rotten logs stacked unevenly and a rusted metal barrel. It must have been decades old. I stood there for a while, imagining what kind of person built it and why they left. The forest felt heavier in that area, like the air didn't move. I didn't stay long. I turned around and carefully retraced my steps back to my camp before the light started fading. By evening, I had a fire going. The orange glow lit up the trees around me and made long shadows on the ground. I cooked a small meal and sat by the fire, writing in a small notebook I carried. Time passed slowly, and as night fell, the forest changed. The daytime sounds, birds, wind, slowly faded, replaced by insects and distant rustles I couldn't identify. Around 10 p.m., I decided to sleep. I put out most of the fire, leaving only a few embers glowing. The tent felt small and quiet. I zipped myself inside the sleeping bag and tried to relax. For a while, everything was still. Then, sometime later, I woke up not from a sound, but from a feeling. It was that quiet kind of alertness your body gets when something feels off. I didn't move at first. Then I heard it, slow footsteps outside, leaves crunching softly, one step at a time. It wasn't the random shuffle of an animal. These were spaced, deliberate. I froze. The steps circled the tent once, then stopped behind me. My heartbeat was loud enough that I could hear it in my ears. I didn't move. After maybe 30 seconds, the sound slowly faded away into the forest. I waited for a long time before I dared to unzip the tent slightly and look outside. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness. Trees, mist, nothing else. I couldn't see anyone or anything. I stayed awake for most of the night, flashlight in hand, listening. Nothing else happened, but I couldn't shake that creeping tension. By morning, I was exhausted. When I stepped outside, I noticed something I hadn't left there. Small footprints in the soft dirt near the edge of my campsite. They were human, barefoot. That's when the uneasiness became real. There shouldn't have been anyone out there. This wasn't a campground. The closest town was miles away. I looked around, scanning the trees, but there was no one. I couldn't tell how old the footprints were, but they looked fresh, maybe from the night before. I decided to pack up, but before I left, curiosity got the better of me. I followed the footprints for a bit. They led toward the direction of the old cabin remains. I followed them carefully, staying alert. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. The air smelled faintly of smoke, though I hadn't seen any fires. The footprints stopped near the old cabin ruins. I looked around, nothing there. No people, no tents, nothing. Just silence. But then I noticed something I hadn't before. Behind the old logs, there was a dugout area covered with branches and leaves, like someone had tried to hide it. I brushed the cover aside and saw a small pit, maybe 3 feet deep. Inside were some rusted tools, an old blanket, and a few empty cans. It looked like someone had been living there at some point, or maybe still was. That's when I decided I had seen enough. I went back to camp and packed everything as fast as I could. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder. The forest that had felt peaceful yesterday now felt completely different, like it was watching me. When I started walking back to my car, I felt a constant awareness that I wasn't alone. Every few minutes, I thought I heard faint footsteps behind me. I'd stop, listen, hear nothing, and keep moving. My heart was racing the entire time. It took me almost 2 hours to reach the clearing where my car was parked. When I got there, I noticed something that made me freeze. The driver's side door was slightly open. I was sure I had locked it. I had double-checked before leaving it behind. I walked closer slowly, gripping the knife in my hand. The car's interior looked fine, nothing stolen, nothing broken. But on the passenger seat, there was a small folded piece of paper. My stomach dropped. I opened it carefully. There was only one sentence written in rough handwriting: "Don't come back." I stood there for a long time just staring at it. The forest was dead silent behind me. I didn't even bother checking further. I threw my gear into the trunk, got into the car, and drove off as fast as I could. Even as I reached the main road, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing on the side of the dirt path. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station about an hour away. I parked and sat there for 10 minutes, catching my breath, trying to process everything. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how lucky I was that nothing worse happened. Whoever that was, whoever had been living out there, had probably been watching me from the moment I set up camp. Maybe they'd been following me since the first day, waiting until dark to check my tent. That thought still makes my stomach turn. I threw the note away that same night, but I can still remember the handwriting clearly. Uneven, shaky, but firm. I never went camping alone again after that. Even now, months later, I still think about those bare footprints and the quiet sound of someone circling my tent in the dark. Sometimes when I drive down a wooded road, I find myself glancing into the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, barefoot and watching, waiting for another camper to wander too deep into the woods. I went camping alone for the first time last summer. I had done smaller day hikes before, but this trip was different. I wanted to spend 3 full nights out in the woods, away from everything. No phone, no noise, no people. I picked a spot deep inside a forest reserve about 5 hours from where I lived. It wasn't a popular camping ground, which made it even more appealing. I wanted quiet, just the sound of wind and the forest. The drive there was long and silent. The road got narrower the deeper I went. The last hour was just gravel and dust, twisting between tall pine trees. When I finally reached the area where I planned to camp, the sun was already lowering, giving the woods that golden color that made everything look peaceful but slightly eerie. I parked my car on the side of a small dirt clearing and started carrying my gear into the trees: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water, knife, flashlight, and a small first aid kit. I found a flat patch of ground about 200 feet from a small creek. The air smelled like damp earth and pine sap. The water made a soft trickling sound, and birds kept calling from somewhere high above. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, like the kind of quiet that makes you aware of every small sound you make. I pitched my tent facing the creek, made a small fire ring with rocks, and collected dry wood before the light disappeared. That first night, I lay inside my tent listening to the forest. Every little rustle made me open my eyes. I told myself it was just animals, maybe a raccoon or a deer. The sound of the creek helped, steady and calming. Around midnight, I woke up to something faint, a crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It came from behind my tent, toward the trees. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped, then started again, slower this time. I tried to look through the thin fabric of the tent, but all I could see was darkness. I waited, my heart beat loud in my ears. After a few minutes, it stopped completely. I lay there awake for a long time, staring at the faint orange glow from the dying fire until I finally fell asleep again. The next morning, I stepped out and looked around. Nothing was disturbed, no animal tracks, no trash dragged away, nothing. I shook it off as my imagination. I made coffee on the small stove, ate some bread, and decided to explore the area. I followed the creek upstream for about an hour. The forest felt endless, thick trees, fallen logs covered in moss, and patches of sunlight breaking through the branches. The air was heavy and still, no wind at all. After some time, I found what looked like a faint trail leading uphill. It wasn't part of any marked path on the map I had printed. Still, curiosity pushed me forward. The climb was steep and quiet, and I could hear my own breathing echo off the trees. Halfway up, I noticed something strange: old camping trash. A crushed tin can, half-burned plastic, and an old rope tied loosely around a tree trunk. It looked like someone had camped there a long time ago and left in a hurry. I didn't think much of it then. I just assumed it was from past campers. At the top, the trees opened a little, and I could see far out over the forest. It was beautiful, endless green stretching to the horizon. But something caught my eye down below, maybe half a mile away. It was a clearing, a small open patch in the trees, and something metallic was shining under the sunlight. It looked like a piece of metal or maybe a roof. I figured it was an old cabin or shed. I decided to go check it out. The way down was rougher, with roots and rocks everywhere. It took me almost half an hour to reach the clearing. When I stepped out of the trees, I saw it clearly, a rusted trailer, half sunk into the ground. The metal sides were eaten by rust, and one of the windows was shattered. There were old bottles scattered nearby, and the door was hanging loose. It looked abandoned for years. Still, being alone out there, seeing something man-made like that, gave me a strange feeling. I walked closer and looked inside. It was empty, no furniture, just dirt and the smell of decay. The walls had old graffiti carved into them. One part caught my eye. Letters scratched deep into the metal, "Stay out." The letters were uneven, like someone had done it in a hurry. I stepped back, suddenly feeling watched. The silence around that trailer felt different, heavier. I couldn't hear the creek anymore or the birds, just still air. I decided to head back to my camp. It was late afternoon by the time I returned, and my fire pit was cold. I lit it again and cooked a can of beans. As the sky darkened, that same unease crept back in. I tried to read the map under the firelight, but I kept thinking about that trailer. Who had stayed there? Why was it abandoned so deep in the woods? That night, I couldn't sleep much. Around midnight again, I heard footsteps, this time closer, slow and steady, circling around the tent. I could hear dry leaves cracking under the weight of something, or someone. I froze, afraid to even breathe. The sound stopped right next to where my head was. I could hear my heart pounding so loud it felt like the whole forest could hear it. Then the sound moved away again, fading slowly until there was nothing but silence. When the sun came up, I checked outside. There were footprints, not animal ones. Human. They weren't from my boots. They looked older, worn-down shoe prints, the kind that had been used for years. They went around my tent and disappeared into the woods. My stomach turned cold. I thought maybe it was a hiker passing by, but no one camped that deep out here, and there were no marked trails near where I was. I packed up my stuff slowly that morning, deciding I'd leave a day early. I just wanted to get out, but part of me still wanted to see if those footprints led back to that trailer. I don't know why. Maybe I just wanted to make sense of what was happening. So I followed them. The prints moved toward the creek, crossed it, and then vanished for a while. I searched the ground carefully, pushing through bushes until I found them again. They led straight toward that same clearing. When I reached the trailer again, it looked slightly different. The door, which had been hanging open, was now closed. I knew I hadn't touched it the last time. My throat felt dry, and my hands were shaking slightly. I walked around to the other side. There, beside the trailer, were more footprints, fresher ones. I crouched down and saw they were the same shape and size as the ones around my tent. The thought hit me hard. Someone had been living here, maybe inside this trailer. Maybe they were watching me last night. The idea made every hair on my body stand up. I didn't go closer. I turned around and started walking fast back to my camp. I packed everything up in minutes, threw my bag over my shoulder, and didn't even bother dousing the fire completely. I just wanted to reach my car. The way back felt longer, like the forest was closing in. Every sound made me spin around, branches snapping, wind moving through the leaves. When I finally reached the clearing where I had parked, I saw something that froze me in place. There were fresh shoe prints right next to my car door, same kind as before. I unlocked the car and got inside quickly, locking all the doors. I sat there trying to breathe. The woods around me were still again, that kind of silence that presses against your ears. I turned the key and started the engine. As I looked through the windshield, I saw movement just for a second. A figure standing between the trees, maybe 50 feet away. I couldn't see their face, just a shape. They didn't move. I drove off, tires spinning on the gravel. I didn't look back again until I was miles away on the main road. My hands were shaking the whole time. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept telling myself it was just a coincidence, maybe a hiker or an old drifter living in the woods. But the thought that they had walked around my tent, maybe watched me while I slept, still makes my stomach turn. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched online for anything about that forest area. I found an old article from years back about a missing man, a survivalist who had lived in those woods for years and disappeared without a trace. His campsite was never found, but they mentioned he used an old trailer deep in the forest as his home base. The location matched exactly where I had been. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining that figure standing in the dark trees, watching as I packed my things. Maybe he hadn't disappeared. Maybe he was still out there, living quietly, keeping people away from his territory. I haven't gone camping alone since then. Every time I think about the sound of those slow footsteps circling my tent, I feel that same fear crawl back. The woods look peaceful from far away, but when you're alone out there, far from anyone who could help, you realize how small you really are and how easily someone could be watching you without you ever knowing. And every now and then, I think about that trailer, that rusted metal with the words scratched deep into it, "Stay out." I should have listened. I went camping alone last summer, something I had been planning for months. I'd spent weeks researching locations that were quiet, far from crowded campsites, and still close enough to reach by car before dark. I found a small clearing near a lake deep inside a national forest. It wasn't listed on any camping websites, but I came across it on an old hiker's forum. The place looked peaceful in the few photos I found. Tall pines surrounding a glassy lake, uneven rocky ground, and a single dirt trail that disappeared into the trees. That kind of isolation felt perfect to me. I wanted silence, a break from constant notifications, noise, and people. I left home early in the morning. The first part of the drive was easy, long stretches of road bordered by wide green fields. But as I got closer to the forest, the path turned rough. The paved road ended at a wooden sign that said, "End of maintenance." From there, it was all gravel and dirt. My car shook as I drove over rocks and potholes, every bump echoing through the frame. I rolled the windows down, and the air changed. It smelled heavy with pine, earth, and something sharp and cold, like wet bark. I reached the clearing just before sunset. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a small backyard, surrounded by tall trees that blocked out most of the sky. The lake was visible through gaps in the branches, a sheet of silver water catching the last orange light of the day. I parked the car near a fallen log and unloaded my gear: tent, food, sleeping bag, water jugs, and a small cooler. Setting up camp took longer than I expected. The ground wasn't even, and I had to move several rocks before staking the tent. The forest was quiet, except for the steady buzz of insects and the occasional flutter of a bird's wings. By the time I finished, the light was gone. I sat near the fire pit I'd made from rocks and cooked a simple meal. The firelight reflected off the trunks around me, and everything outside that circle of light felt swallowed in blackness. As I sat there eating, I noticed something strange. Every few minutes, I would hear a short rustling sound in the distance, always coming from the same direction, the tree line opposite the lake. It wasn't constant, just enough to make me stop and listen. It didn't sound like wind or small animals. It was heavier, more deliberate. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably a deer or raccoon moving through the undergrowth. Still, I kept glancing up every time I heard it. When I finally decided to sleep, the forest had gone completely silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. I crawled into the tent, zipped the entrance shut, and lay in my sleeping bag. The ground was cold, and every time I shifted, I could hear the dry leaves underneath crackle faintly. I closed my eyes, trying to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. At some point in the night, I woke up suddenly. It wasn't because of a sound, it was because of the absence of one. The kind of quiet that feels heavy, pressing down on your ears. My watch said 2:43 a.m. I listened for several seconds before I heard something faint, a distant splash coming from the direction of the lake. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to slice through the silence. Then came another one. It sounded like someone throwing a stone into the water, pausing, then throwing another. I told myself it could be fish or maybe something falling from a branch, but the spacing between each splash felt too controlled. I stayed still, heart pounding, listening for any other sign of movement. Then I heard soft footsteps, barely audible, moving through the wet leaves near the edge of the clearing. Slow, steady steps. I froze, holding my breath. They came closer for a few seconds, then stopped. I didn't move for almost an hour. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back into a light, uneasy sleep. When I woke again, the sky was faintly blue, and the forest had returned to normal. Birds chirped, insects buzzed, and the surface of the lake glistened under the morning sun. I stepped outside the tent, stretching, pretending the night had just been my imagination. But when I walked toward the lake, I saw something that made my stomach twist. There were footprints along the muddy edge of the water. Not animal prints, shoes. The ground was soft from dew, and the prints were fresh. They led from the trees toward the lake, then disappeared right into the water. I crouched to look closer. They were deep enough to belong to an adult man. The strange part was they didn't come back out. I stood there for a long time, staring at the pattern. I checked around the clearing for any sign that someone had passed through. Broken branches, new footprints, but there was nothing else. The forest looked untouched. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe a fisherman had come early in the morning, waded into the water, and left from another direction. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I spent most of the day hiking a short trail that looped around the lake. It was narrow and overgrown, with thick bushes brushing against my clothes as I moved. A few times, I saw signs of old campsites, burnt-out fire pits, empty cans rusted through, and rope tied around branches. They looked abandoned for years. Near one of them, I found a torn piece of fabric tangled in a bush. It looked like part of a jacket sleeve, sun-faded and stiff from age. I left it there and kept walking. When I returned to camp in the afternoon, I noticed something subtle but strange. My cooler had been moved. Not far, just a few inches from where I'd left it. The lid was slightly open, and one of the food packets inside was missing. At first, I thought maybe an animal had pulled it, but there were no bite marks or scratches. The latch was unclipped like it had been opened by a hand. That night, I decided not to light a fire. I wanted the darkness to hide me, to blend into the forest rather than stand out as a glowing target. I ate a small meal inside the tent, zipped myself in, and kept my flashlight beside me. I didn't sleep much. Every few minutes, I would hear faint noises outside. Leaves moving, a distant snap of twigs. Each sound made me tense up. At one point, I thought I heard breathing, slow and rhythmic, just beyond the tent wall. The smell of damp earth and smoke filled the air. I gripped my flashlight, pointing it toward the fabric, but I didn't turn it on. The breathing lasted only a few seconds before stopping completely. I waited, still holding my breath, until my eyes started to blur from exhaustion. Eventually, I must have dozed off again. In the morning, I found the footprints again, this time much closer to the tent. They circled halfway around it, stopping right near where my head had been while I slept. My stomach dropped. Whoever it was had been standing there quietly in the middle of the night. The thought of someone watching me while I slept made my hands shake. I packed up that morning. It took longer than usual because I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. When everything was in the car, I took one last look at the clearing. The air was calm, the water perfectly still, the forest deceptively peaceful. But there was something heavy about that silence, something that made me want to leave immediately. The drive out felt endless. The road seemed bumpier than before, and I kept checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. About halfway down the dirt path, I noticed a shape through the trees. A man standing far off the road, between two large trunks. He wasn't moving, just standing there, turned slightly toward the road. He was too far to make out any details, but I could tell he was tall, wearing dark clothing. My heart hammered as I pressed the gas pedal harder, not daring to slow down. When I finally reached the main road, I didn't stop until I was miles away. I pulled over near a gas station, stepped out, and leaned against the car, trying to calm myself. My shirt was damp with sweat even though the air was cool. I stayed there for nearly an hour before continuing home. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up news stories about the area, trying to find any mention of disappearances or crimes near the lake. There wasn't much, just a short article from about 8 years ago. It mentioned a missing camper whose belongings were found near that same lake. The article didn't say what happened to him, only that search efforts were eventually called off. I still think about that trip sometimes, especially at night when everything is quiet. The image that sticks with me most isn't the footprints or the noise outside my tent. It's the man standing in the trees, watching silently. I don't know how long he'd been there or how many nights he'd been moving around my camp. I haven't gone camping since then. Every time I think about going back into the woods, I remember those footprints leading into the water and how they never came out. Maybe whoever left them never meant to, or maybe they were still there, waiting for someone else to show up alone. I try not to think about it too much, but sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I still feel that same pressure of silence. The kind that makes you listen harder, just to realize you're not sure anymore if you're the only one there. I had been planning a solo camping trip for months. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, from the constant buzz of work and screens and people. I wanted to hear nothing but the sound of wind through trees and water moving over stones. It wasn't about adventure, it was about peace. I found a small, lesser-known campsite deep inside a forest reserve. Most people didn't go there because it didn't have proper trails or facilities. That was exactly why I chose it. I packed everything I could possibly need. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, knife, flashlight, batteries, a map, and my old hiking boots that had already seen a dozen trips. I left early in the morning. The drive took about 4 hours through twisting roads and small rural towns. Once I parked my car at the last allowed point, I had to walk for another 2 hours. The air grew cooler the deeper I went into the forest. The trees were so tall they blocked most of the sunlight. The sound of birds echoed far away, but other than that, there wasn't much noise. I remember thinking how still everything felt, like the forest had been asleep for a long time. When I reached a small clearing near a river bend, I decided to set up camp there. The grass was short, the ground was flat, and there was enough space to build a small fire. The river wasn't wide, but the water was clear and cold. I pitched my tent, unpacked my gear, and took a few photos. The place looked untouched, like no one had been there in years. I could see animal tracks near the water, probably deer or maybe raccoons. There were no signs of other people. By late afternoon, I had a fire going and was boiling water for coffee. The smoke from the fire drifted lazily into the sky, and the orange glow reflected off the trees. I remember sitting there, feeling like I was exactly where I needed to be. I ate a quick meal, canned beans and bread, and then walked a bit along the river just exploring. The light dimmed fast, and I returned before it got dark. When night finally settled in, it came heavy, the kind of darkness that feels thick, where the world outside your fire disappears completely. I lay inside my tent listening to the soft rush of the river. Every so often, I'd hear small rustling noises, but that was normal. Small animals, maybe wind moving the branches. It didn't bother me. I fell asleep fast. Sometime during the night, I woke up. There wasn't a sound, not even the river. I thought maybe I had imagined it, but the silence was too complete. It's strange how you can sense when something feels wrong without seeing anything. I sat up, listening harder. The air felt heavier, colder. My tent fabric moved slightly, like a faint push of air hit it from one side. Then there was a crunch of dry leaves, very slow, very deliberate. My body went rigid. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on. The beam hit the fabric of the tent, casting shadows from outside. I couldn't see anything moving, but I knew there was something out there. Maybe a deer, I thought, or a wild boar, but the sound wasn't of an animal sniffing or walking in bursts. It was slow, like footsteps. I stayed still for a long time. Eventually, the sound faded. After a few more minutes, I convinced myself it was probably nothing serious. Maybe I had overreacted. I turned off the light and lay back down, but it took a long time before I fell asleep again. The next morning, when I stepped outside, the first thing I noticed was the ground. There were faint footprints near the edge of the trees. Not animal tracks, human ones. They weren't large, but they were fresh. The soil was still slightly pressed down. They led toward the river and then disappeared. I tried to tell myself maybe a hiker had passed by, though I hadn't heard anyone earlier. Still, I didn't want to think too much about it. I spent the morning collecting some firewood and filtering water from the river. Everything felt normal again once the sun was up. Later that day, I decided to hike deeper into the woods. I followed the river upstream for about an hour. I found old remnants of a campfire near a large rock, a few burnt logs, some rusted cans. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but what caught my attention was a small torn piece of fabric stuck to a branch. It looked like part of a backpack strap or maybe clothing. Faded green, like military material. I took a picture and left it there. The deeper I went, the thicker the trees grew. It was getting harder to move through. After another 30 minutes, I turned back. When I got back to camp, something felt off immediately. My tent flap was open. I always zipped it closed. Inside, my sleeping bag had been shifted, and one of my food packets was missing. I looked around, expecting to see signs of an animal, but there were none. No bite marks, no torn plastic, nothing scattered. It was like someone had opened it, taken what they wanted, and left quietly. I stood there for a long time trying to process it. My car was far away, and there was no one around for miles. The thought that someone could have been watching me made my stomach twist. I decided to stay calm. I checked my surroundings again, secured my things, and sat by the fire. I thought maybe it was a drifter or someone living off the grid. If they wanted to harm me, they already had a chance. I kept a knife near me that night just in case. The forest was loud again. Crickets, wind, the occasional owl. I tried to convince myself that was a good sign, but at around midnight, I woke again to that same heavy silence. Not even the insects made a sound. The air was colder than before. My fire had almost gone out. I sat up slowly and listened. Then came the faint sound of movement, slow steps, moving through the trees. Not running, just pacing. They came closer, stopped, and then circled. My hands were shaking as I held the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on this time. I didn't want to give away my position. The sound stopped, then started again, this time behind me. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. After what felt like forever, I heard a small splash in the river, like someone stepped into it carefully. Then nothing, just silence again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there waiting for dawn. When light finally came, I packed up fast. I didn't even make breakfast. I just wanted to leave. As I was rolling up the tent, I noticed something near the edge of the clearing. A small pile of stones, stacked neatly. I hadn't seen it there before. It wasn't big, but it was deliberate. 3 flat stones on top of one another, right where the path led into the forest. It didn't feel like nature had done that. I started walking fast, keeping my knife visible. My heart wouldn't slow down. Every sound made me flinch. It took me over 2 hours to reach where I had parked. My car was still there, untouched. I threw my gear inside and locked the doors immediately. When I finally started driving, I kept checking the mirrors. The forest felt different leaving it than it had when I arrived. Less peaceful, more watchful. On the way home, I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints, the missing food, the silence, and that small stack of stones. It wasn't supernatural, it was human. That made it worse. Somewhere out there, someone had been watching me, maybe living quietly in that forest, hidden from everyone. Maybe they didn't like people coming near their area. Maybe they wanted to scare me enough to never come back. When I got home, I couldn't sleep for days. Every sound at night made me tense. I kept seeing those footprints in my head. I checked online for any reports about missing hikers in that area. There were a few from years back, all with vague details. One mentioned a man who went camping alone and never came back. His car was found parked where I had left mine. They never found his body. That part stayed with me. It made me think how easily I could have been another story like that. Just someone who vanished in the woods. No one would ever know what really happened. I sometimes wonder if the person who was watching me had done it before, if maybe I got lucky because I left early. Maybe they didn't expect me to pack up so soon. I haven't been camping since then. I still love the outdoors, but now when I see forests, I feel uneasy. It's not the idea of animals or ghosts that bothers me. It's the quiet, patient kind of danger that comes from people who live in the shadows, people who don't want to be found. Every time I think about that night, I remember the sound of the footsteps, the silence that followed, and the way the air felt like it was holding its breath. I remember how small that clearing looked in the daylight, and how it felt like I had been somewhere I shouldn't have been. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still see that stack of stones at the edge of the clearing, silent, balanced, waiting. I had planned that camping trip for months. I needed to get away from people, from the noise, from everything that had been eating away at me. I'd been working late nights, barely sleeping, and my head felt heavy all the time. I wanted silence, real silence. No phones, no traffic, no city lights, just nature and my own thoughts. I picked a spot deep inside a forest reserve up north. It wasn't an official camping ground, but people sometimes went there for hunting or solo camping. I'd seen it on a forum. Someone had mentioned it was peaceful, almost forgotten, and that sounded perfect to me. I packed everything. Tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, flashlight, extra batteries, a knife, a small axe, and enough food for 4 days. I left early in the morning so I could reach there before sunset. The drive took almost 6 hours. The last part was through an old dirt road that twisted through thick woods. My car bounced over uneven ground, branches scraping the sides as I drove deeper. The forest grew dense around me, darker even though it was still afternoon. I stopped where the road ended, a small clearing with a patch of flat ground and a few stumps. I parked there and carried my backpack into the woods until I found a spot next to a stream. The sound of running water instantly calmed me. The air smelled clean, like damp soil and pine. I set up my tent, built a small fire pit, and collected dry branches from the ground. The fire came alive easily. I sat beside it, eating a can of beans straight from the tin, listening to nothing but the soft crackle and the gurgle of the stream. For a while, I felt exactly what I came for, quiet. When night came, the forest turned pitch black. The firelight barely reached beyond a few feet. I lay inside the tent, hearing the forest move, the wind brushing leaves, the occasional creak of trees shifting, distant sounds of animals I couldn't see. It wasn't scary, not yet. It felt raw and alive. Sometime around midnight, I woke up. I didn't know why. The fire had gone out, and the night air was cold. I sat up, listening. There was no sound of animals now. No wind either. Just silence, thick, unnatural silence. My heart started beating faster. I unzipped the tent slowly and looked out. I couldn't see much, just outlines of trees under faint moonlight. Then I noticed something odd. The woods looked slightly different, as if something had moved. Some branches that had been near the fire pit earlier now looked broken. I got out, turned on my flashlight, and looked around the site. Everything seemed normal. My food containers were closed, my bag untouched, but there were footprints near the stream. Not animal prints. Shoes. They weren't mine. They came from the woods and stopped near the stream, maybe 10 or 12 feet from my tent. Then they turned back the same way. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was some hiker passing by, but at night, in this area, I hadn't seen a single soul all day. I couldn't shake the unease. I added more wood to the fire and sat there until dawn, trying to tell myself it was nothing. The next morning, The forest looked harmless again. Birds were chirping, the stream glittered in sunlight, and I tried to convince myself that maybe I'd imagined the footprints wrong. I spent the day hiking along the stream, collecting firewood, and cooking instant noodles near the fire pit. Everything felt normal until late afternoon, when I noticed something again. My tent's zipper was slightly open. I was sure I had closed it tightly. Inside, my sleeping bag had been moved. My flashlight and knife were where I'd left them, but my backpack looked like someone had rummaged through it. My dry food packs were rearranged, but nothing was missing. I looked around the trees, expecting to see someone watching. No one was there. The forest was quiet again, too quiet. That night, I built the fire larger and sat close to it, knife in my lap. The air grew colder. Around 1 a.m., I heard movement again. Something soft, like steps pressing into grass. I turned the flashlight in the direction of the sound. For a split second, I thought I saw movement between the trees, a shadow shifting behind a trunk. But when I looked again, there was nothing. I didn't sleep. I waited for sunrise, sitting there half awake, staring at the tree line. By morning, I had made up my mind. I'd stay one more night and then leave. I didn't want to panic and leave in the middle of nowhere. The dirt road was rough and not safe to drive at night. I told myself I was overthinking things. I went down to the stream to wash my face, and that's when I saw them again. Footprints, fresh ones, the same shoe pattern, leading right up to the spot where I had been sitting last night by the fire. Whoever it was, they had come very close while I was awake. I felt a knot in my stomach. I checked my surroundings again, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. I stayed alert the whole day, barely eating, barely moving from the site. When the sun began to set again, the forest darkened faster than usual. The sky was red for a few minutes, then everything turned gray and shadowy. I built the fire higher, the flames flickering against the trunks around me. I kept my flashlight beside me, hand gripping the knife tight. It was quiet for hours. Then I heard something that froze me. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was a faint clinking sound, metal against metal, coming from somewhere behind my tent. I turned slowly and shined the flashlight in that direction. Nothing. The sound stopped. I stood up, walked a few steps, scanning the darkness, and then I saw something hanging from a low branch near the trees. An empty tin can tied with a thin string. It swung slightly, like it had just been touched. Someone had hung it there. I didn't know if it was meant to scare me or alert them if I moved. My chest felt tight. I grabbed my backpack, shoved my essentials inside, and decided to sleep in my car that night. I didn't even bother taking down the tent. I walked quickly, the flashlight beam jumping across roots and branches. The car wasn't far, maybe 10 minutes through the woods. The forest felt alive again, twigs snapping somewhere behind me, faint rustling that stopped every time I stopped. I didn't run, but my pace kept getting faster. When I reached the car, my relief was short-lived. The passenger door was open. I was sure I'd locked it. My heart dropped as I looked inside. Everything from the front seat was scattered, the map, my charger, the small toolkit. But nothing was stolen. It was as if someone had searched through it deliberately. I slammed the door, locked it, and sat inside, trying to calm down. I stayed there until dawn, barely blinking. I didn't sleep once. Every now and then, I thought I saw shapes moving between trees at the edge of the clearing, but maybe my eyes were just playing tricks. At first light, I started the engine and drove away. The tires slid over mud, the car jerking as I sped through the uneven path, scraping branches, rocks hitting the undercarriage. When I reached the paved road again, I didn't stop until I was miles away. I found a gas station and parked there. I got out, stretched, and walked to the restroom. My reflection in the mirror looked pale and tired. When I came back to the car, I noticed something on the rear windshield, stuck to the glass with mud. It was a small piece of cloth, dark green, torn, with a bit of string attached, the same kind of string I'd seen tied to the tin can. I pulled it off and threw it away, but that uneasiness never really left. Days later, when I unpacked my things at home, I noticed something strange again. Inside my backpack, deep at the bottom, There was a folded piece of paper that wasn't mine. I opened it. It was a hand-drawn map of the forest, with several small circles marked along a line that led to the stream where I'd camped. At the end of the line, near my campsite, was a small X. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't know who had drawn it or what those circles meant, but I realized something. Whoever had been in those woods with me had probably been there before, many times. Maybe they were tracking campers. Maybe they lived out there. I didn't want to think about it anymore. That night, even though I was home, I kept hearing the faint sound of metal clinking, like that tin can in the wind. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves. But every time I closed my eyes, I could picture those footprints near my tent, stopping right where I had been sitting, and I knew I'd never go camping alone again. Sometimes, when I think about that map, I wonder what those other circles meant. Campsites? Victims? Or maybe just marks of where someone had already been. Either way, I was lucky. I left before I became another mark on that page. I went camping alone last summer, something I had been planning for months. I'd spent weeks researching locations that were quiet, far from crowded campsites, and still close enough to reach by car before dark. I found a small clearing near a lake deep inside a national forest. It wasn't listed on any camping websites, but I came across it on an old hiker's forum. The place looked peaceful in the few photos I found. Tall pines surrounding a glassy lake, uneven rocky ground, and a single dirt trail that disappeared into the trees. That kind of isolation felt perfect to me. I wanted silence, a break from constant notifications, noise, and people. I left home early in the morning. The first part of the drive was easy, long stretches of road bordered by wide green fields. But as I got closer to the forest, the path turned rough. The paved road ended at a wooden sign that said, "End of maintenance." From there, it was all gravel and dirt. My car shook as I drove over rocks and potholes, every bump echoing through the frame. I rolled the windows down, and the air changed. It smelled heavy with pine, earth, and something sharp and cold, like wet bark. I reached the clearing just before sunset. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a small backyard, surrounded by tall trees that blocked out most of the sky. The lake was visible through gaps in the branches, a sheet of silver water catching the last orange light of the day. I parked the car near a fallen log and unloaded my gear: tent, food, sleeping bag, water jugs, and a small cooler. Setting up camp took longer than I expected. The ground wasn't even, and I had to move several rocks before staking the tent. The forest was quiet, except for the steady buzz of insects and the occasional flutter of a bird's wings. By the time I finished, the light was gone. I sat near the fire pit I'd made from rocks and cooked a simple meal. The firelight reflected off the trunks around me, and everything outside that circle of light felt swallowed in blackness. As I sat there eating, I noticed something strange. Every few minutes, I would hear a short rustling sound in the distance, always coming from the same direction, the tree line opposite the lake. It wasn't constant, just enough to make me stop and listen. It didn't sound like wind or small animals. It was heavier, more deliberate. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably a deer or raccoon moving through the undergrowth. Still, I kept glancing up every time I heard it. When I finally decided to sleep, the forest had gone completely silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. I crawled into the tent, zipped the entrance shut, and lay in my sleeping bag. The ground was cold, and every time I shifted, I could hear the dry leaves underneath crackle faintly. I closed my eyes, trying to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. At some point in the night, I woke up suddenly. It wasn't because of a sound, it was because of the absence of one. The kind of quiet that feels heavy, pressing down on your ears. My watch said 2:43 a.m. I listened for several seconds before I heard something faint, a distant splash coming from the direction of the lake. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to slice through the silence. Then came another one. It sounded like someone throwing a stone into the water, pausing, then throwing another. I told myself it could be fish, or maybe something falling from a branch. But the spacing between each splash felt too controlled. I stayed still, heart pounding, listening for any other sign of movement. Then I heard soft footsteps, barely audible, moving through the wet leaves near the edge of the clearing. Slow, steady steps. I froze, holding my breath. They came closer for a few seconds, then stopped. I didn't move for almost an hour. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back into a light, uneasy sleep. When I woke again, the sky was faintly blue, and the forest had returned to normal. Birds chirped, insects buzzed, and the surface of the lake glistened under the morning sun. I stepped outside the tent, stretching, pretending the night had just been my imagination. But when I walked toward the lake, I saw something that made my stomach twist. There were footprints along the muddy edge of the water. Not animal prints, shoes. The ground was soft from dew, and the prints were fresh. They led from the trees toward the lake, then disappeared right into the water. I crouched to look closer. They were deep enough to belong to an adult man. The strange part was they didn't come back out. I stood there for a long time, staring at the pattern. I checked around the clearing for any sign that someone had passed through. Broken branches, new footprints, but there was nothing else. The forest looked untouched. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe a fisherman had come early in the morning, waded into the water, and left from another direction. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I spent most of the day hiking a short trail that looped around the lake. It was narrow and overgrown, with thick bushes brushing against my clothes as I moved. A few times, I saw signs of old campsites, burnt-out fire pits, empty cans rusted through, and rope tied around branches. They looked abandoned for years. Near one of them, I found a torn piece of fabric tangled in a bush. It looked like part of a jacket sleeve, sun-faded and stiff from age. I left it there and kept walking. When I returned to camp in the afternoon, I noticed something subtle but strange. My cooler had been moved. Not far, just a few inches from where I'd left it. The lid was slightly open, and one of the food packets inside was missing. At first, I thought maybe an animal had pulled it, but there were no bite marks or scratches. The latch was unclipped like it had been opened by a hand. That night, I decided not to light a fire. I wanted the darkness to hide me, to blend into the forest rather than stand out as a glowing target. I ate a small meal inside the tent, zipped myself in, and kept my flashlight beside me. I didn't sleep much. Every few minutes, I would hear faint noises outside. Leaves moving, a distant snap of twigs. Each sound made me tense up. At one point, I thought I heard breathing, slow and rhythmic, just beyond the tent wall. The smell of damp earth and smoke filled the air. I gripped my flashlight, pointing it toward the fabric, but I didn't turn it on. The breathing lasted only a few seconds before stopping completely. I waited, still holding my breath, until my eyes started to blur from exhaustion. Eventually, I must have dozed off again. In the morning, I found the footprints again, this time much closer to the tent. They circled halfway around it, stopping right near where my head had been while I slept. My stomach dropped. Whoever it was had been standing there quietly in the middle of the night. The thought of someone watching me while I slept made my hands shake. I packed up that morning. It took longer than usual because I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. When everything was in the car, I took one last look at the clearing. The air was calm, the water perfectly still, the forest deceptively peaceful. But there was something heavy about that silence, something that made me want to leave immediately. The drive out felt endless. The road seemed bumpier than before, and I kept checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. About halfway down the dirt path, I noticed a shape through the trees. A man standing far off the road, between two large trunks. He wasn't moving, just standing there, turned slightly toward the road. He was too far to make out any details, but I could tell he was tall, wearing dark clothing. My heart hammered as I pressed the gas pedal harder, not daring to slow down. When I finally reached the main road, I didn't stop until I was miles away. I pulled over near a gas station, stepped out, and leaned against the car, trying to calm myself. My shirt was damp with sweat even though the air was cool. I stayed there for nearly an hour before continuing home. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up news stories about the area, trying to find any mention of disappearances or crimes near the lake. There wasn't much, just a short article from about 8 years ago. It mentioned a missing camper whose belongings were found near that same lake. The article didn't say what happened to him, only that search efforts were eventually called off. I still think about that trip sometimes, especially at night when everything is quiet. The image that sticks with me most isn't the footprints or the noise outside my tent. It's the man standing in the trees, watching silently. I don't know how long he'd been there or how many nights he'd been moving around my camp. I haven't gone camping since then. Every time I think about going back into the woods, I remember those footprints leading into the water and how they never came out. Maybe whoever left them never meant to, or maybe they were still there, waiting for someone else to show up alone. I try not to think about it too much, but sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I still feel that same pressure of silence. The kind that makes you listen harder, just to realize you're not sure anymore if you're the only one there. I went camping alone that weekend because I needed space from everything. Work had been eating me alive, my phone never stopped buzzing, and I felt like I was being pulled in every direction. I wanted silence, just me, the woods, and the sound of wind through the trees. I picked a random spot far away from any official campsite, a stretch of forest near a lake, about 3 hours from town. The place was remote, the kind of area where even phone signals fade halfway in. That's what I wanted, to disappear for a couple of days and breathe again. I started the drive early on a Friday morning. The roads were empty for the most part. As I got closer, the landscape started changing. Highways turned into cracked asphalt and then into gravel. The GPS cut out near a cluster of old pine trees, and I followed a dirt trail I had marked earlier using an offline map. The deeper I went, the denser the forest grew. Trees leaned over the narrow path, branches scraping the sides of my car. I felt that small flicker of unease that always comes when civilization starts slipping away, but I pushed it down. I'd done smaller trips before. This was just another one, only quieter. After about 40 minutes of slow driving, I reached a clearing big enough for one tent and a small campfire pit. The lake was about 200 feet away, visible through the trees. The air smelled damp, pine, wet earth, and something faintly metallic, maybe from the water. The ground was uneven but dry enough. I parked beside a large fallen log and started unloading my gear, tent, sleeping bag, stove, cooler, and a foldable chair. It took me about an hour to get everything set up. I built the tent facing the lake so I could wake up to the view. The air was crisp and quiet, except for the constant hum of insects. I made a small fire using dry wood from the edges of the clearing. It caught quickly, crackling softly as the orange light flickered across the bark of the trees. I felt a calm I hadn't felt in months. As evening rolled in, the forest started changing. The birds went silent first, replaced by the distant creaks of trees and the faint splash of something in the lake. I ate a quick dinner, canned beans and a granola bar, and sat by the fire, watching the light fade. The forest turned darker than I expected, pitch black past the reach of the flames. I stared into it, trying to adjust my eyes, but the darkness seemed thick, like it was swallowing everything. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I wasn't used to silence like this. At home, there was always background noise, traffic, neighbors, something. Out here, every sound felt amplified. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the splash of water. Each noise made me lift my head. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I poured water on the fire until it hissed and climbed into my tent. The nylon walls glowed faintly from the small lantern inside. I zipped up my sleeping bag, checked my phone one last time. No signal, and turned off the light. For a while, everything was still. Then I started hearing it, faint footsteps. Not the random pattern of an animal. These were spaced out, deliberate. They crunched softly on the dry leaves, stopped, and started again. I froze. My mind tried to reason with me. Probably a deer, maybe a raccoon, but something about the rhythm of it felt off. Too heavy, too slow. I didn't move. I just listened. The steps circled around, keeping distance from the tent. I could hear them stopping near my car, then shifting back toward the fire pit. My breathing got louder inside the sleeping bag. After a while, they stopped completely. I waited for maybe 10 minutes, staring at the faint outline of the tent fabric. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. When I woke up, it was dawn. The light was gray and soft. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The air was cold, and dew clung to the grass. Everything looked normal. The campfire was cold, the car was fine, and the trees were still. But then I noticed something strange near the edge of the clearing. Footprints. Not boot prints, bare feet. They were small, like a child's, but the steps were deep, pressed hard into the mud. They went from the edge of the woods to the side of my car and then back into the trees. My chest tightened. I knelt down and traced one of them with my finger. It was fresh, maybe made during the night. I looked around, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. I tried to shake it off. Maybe someone lived nearby and wandered through. Still, the thought of someone barefoot walking around my car in the dark stuck in my head. I packed my things into the tent and went down to the lake to clear my thoughts. The water was calm, like glass. I crouched at the edge, washing my hands, and that's when I noticed something else. Across the lake, on the opposite shore, there was a figure. Far away, maybe 200 yards, but unmistakably human. They were standing still, half hidden by trees. I couldn't make out details, just the shape. I stared for a long time, waiting for them to move, but they didn't. After a few seconds, I looked away to grab my water bottle. When I looked back, the figure was gone. I went back to camp, uneasy but pretending it didn't bother me. I made coffee, ate breakfast, and sat for a while. The forest was bright now, and that helped. Birds were back, chirping and fluttering between branches. Still, that tension in my chest didn't leave. By noon, I decided to explore a bit. I followed a narrow animal trail that ran behind the clearing and curved deeper into the forest. The path was barely visible in places, covered in moss and roots. The deeper I went, the colder the air felt, like sunlight couldn't reach through the trees. After about 20 minutes of walking, I found something that made me stop. A small wooden structure, barely standing, maybe an old hunting blind or storage shack. It was about the size of a closet, made of rotting boards and half swallowed by vines. The door was missing. Inside, it was empty, just damp dirt and broken pieces of wood. But on one of the inside walls, someone had scratched deep lines, dozens of them, overlapping. It looked like tally marks. I don't know why, but I counted them. 47. There was no reason for it to scare me, but it did. Something about it felt deliberate, like someone had been keeping track of something, days maybe, or people. I stepped back, feeling watched, even though there was no one around. I didn't stay long. When I got back to camp, the sun was starting to drop again. The air grew colder. I rebuilt the fire and tried to focus on small things, boiling water, cleaning my mess kit, adjusting the tent stakes. It helped for a while, but that night the noises came back. First the footsteps, again, circling. Then something brushed against the side of the tent. I could hear the faint drag of fingers on the fabric, slow and deliberate. My stomach twisted. I reached for my flashlight and held it tight but didn't turn it on. I didn't want whoever or whatever it was to know I was awake. It stopped after a few minutes. Then came another sound, softer this time. The faint click of my car door handle. I froze. I knew I had locked it earlier. I could hear the handle move again, like someone trying it repeatedly. Then silence. I stayed awake the whole night, barely breathing, staring at the tent ceiling until the first hint of light came through. When I finally stepped outside, I saw that my car door was slightly open. Just the driver's side, not enough to swing out, but definitely not shut. I looked inside. Everything seemed untouched. My keys, wallet, and phone were still there. Then I noticed the glove compartment was open, and the small hunting knife I kept there was missing. That was the moment I decided I had to leave. I packed everything as fast as I could, barely eating. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my coffee mug twice. I kept looking at the woods, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing. The forest looked as calm and empty as ever. Before I got into the car, I walked to the edge of the clearing one last time, just to make sure I wasn't imagining it all. That's when I saw it. Hanging from a low tree branch near where I'd found the footprints was my missing knife. It was stabbed into the bark, the blade facing down, the handle slick with dew. I stared at it for a long time, the morning light hitting the metal. It hadn't been there before. Whoever took it had put it there during the night, close enough for me to see before leaving. Like they wanted me to. I didn't touch it. I just got into the car and drove. The drive back felt endless. Every tree looked the same. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step onto the road behind me. My hands stayed clenched around the steering wheel the whole time. When I finally reached the main road, I stopped at a gas station. The attendant gave me a quick look. I must have looked terrible. I didn't say much, just filled up the tank, grabbed a bottle of water, and sat in the car for a long while, staring out the windshield. I thought about the footprints, the shack, the knife. Whoever had been out there hadn't tried to hurt me. I've always loved camping alone. There's something about being deep in the woods with nothing but a tent, a small fire, and the quiet around you that feels cleansing. It resets me. I used to go every few months, mostly to the same forest about 3 hours from where I lived. It wasn't a tourist area. No marked trails, no ranger stations, no campers with loud music. Just endless trees, a river nearby, and enough open ground to set up camp. That's how I liked it. Quiet, private, and simple. This particular trip started like all the others. I packed my gear the night before. Tent, sleeping bag, knife, flashlight, lighter, a few canned meals, and a small backpacking stove. I also brought my old metal water bottle and a filter straw in case I needed to refill from the river. I left my phone in airplane mode most of the time out there, only turning it on for maps. It was early autumn, cool but not freezing. The leaves had started to change, and there was that sharp, earthy smell in the air that I've always liked. I parked my car off a dirt road, hiked for about an hour, and found a small clearing near the edge of the forest. I'd camped there once before. It was flat, dry, and not far from the river. By the time I set up the tent, it was mid-afternoon. The light filtered through the trees in that golden way that makes everything look peaceful. I collected some fallen branches for firewood and started boiling water for coffee. The sound of the river in the distance mixed with the crackle of the fire made me feel completely relaxed. I spent the rest of the day walking around, just exploring. I always liked seeing what had changed since my last visit. Fallen trees, new animal tracks, small signs of nature constantly shifting. The forest was quiet that day, even more than usual. I didn't see or hear much wildlife, which was strange. Normally, I'd at least hear birds or the occasional squirrel. Still, it didn't bother me much at the time. I thought maybe the weather was about to change. As the sun dropped lower, I returned to camp. I made dinner, just a can of chili heated on the small stove, and watched the sky fade from orange to purple through the trees. By nightfall, I had a decent fire going and sat there listening to the wood pop and hiss. The air was cool enough that the warmth felt good on my hands. Then I heard something. It wasn't loud, just a short sound, like a branch snapping. I turned toward the noise, but the woods looked empty. I figured it might have been a deer. They're common around there. I kept sitting by the fire, trying not to think much of it. But a few minutes later, I heard it again, closer this time. Another snap, followed by a rustle, then silence. It made me uneasy. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees, but the light didn't reach far. The forest absorbs light at night. It's strange how quickly it disappears into the dark. I waited, listened, nothing. So I went back to the fire, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I stayed awake for a while longer, just listening. Every small sound felt sharper, louder, like the forest was holding its breath. When the fire finally died down, I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. I kept the flashlight beside me. Sometime during the night, I woke up to a noise outside. It was faint, but it wasn't the normal sound of branches moving in the wind. It was heavier, slow footsteps in the dirt, just outside my tent. My chest tightened instantly. I held my breath, listening as the steps moved around the tent, steady and deliberate. Whoever or whatever it wasn't trying to be quiet. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loudly. I just lay there, frozen, listening. The steps stopped near the back of the tent. Then silence. That silence felt endless. My mind was racing. If it was an animal, it should have moved away by now. If it was a person, why were they circling my tent in the middle of nowhere? After a few minutes that felt like an hour, I finally reached for my knife. I kept it close, not daring to unzip the tent or shine my flashlight. I waited like that for a long time until eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted back to sleep. When I woke up, it was dawn. My first thought was the footsteps. I stepped outside the tent and looked around carefully. The ground was covered in leaves, but near the back of the tent, I saw them, prints. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet. I could see the shape of toes, the deep heel marks pressed into the soft dirt. They weren't mine. I looked around for more tracks. There were several, spaced unevenly, leading off into the trees and fading near the thicker brush. The prints were wide and short, not like a normal adult's. My stomach twisted. Someone, or something, had been walking barefoot through the forest that night, circling my tent. I tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was a hiker. Maybe someone camping nearby had wandered around drunk. But deep down, I knew how unlikely that was. Nobody camped out here but me. The nearest marked campsite was miles away. I decided to leave. I packed up quickly, stuffing everything back into my backpack. The air felt heavier than usual, like the forest was watching. When I got to where I'd parked, I noticed something that made my stomach drop even more. The back window of my car was smeared with dirt. Not scratched or broken, just smeared, like someone had dragged their hand across it. A handprint. That's when I started to feel truly afraid. I got in the car and locked the doors immediately. I drove for about 30 minutes before I started to relax again. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone walking along the dirt road behind me. After a while, I stopped at a small gas station on the way back to town. I bought a coffee and stood outside for a bit, trying to make sense of everything. Maybe someone was living out there in the woods, completely off the grid. It would explain the bare feet, the strange behavior. But then why circle my tent? Why touch my car? I didn't go camping again for a while after that. Months passed, and eventually, I convinced myself I had overreacted. Fear can do strange things to your mind in the dark. I told myself it was probably nothing serious, just someone passing through, maybe looking for food or shelter. I shouldn't let one weird experience ruin something I loved. So the next summer, I went back. Not to the same exact spot, but close. About a mile or two from where it happened. The forest looked different this time. The trees were greener, the ground covered in thick grass and fallen branches. Felt alive again. I set up camp beside the river, thinking the sound of running water might help me sleep. I brought more supplies this time, including a small hatchet and a better flashlight. The first night was peaceful. I cooked, listened to the water, and fell asleep without any strange noises. I woke up early, feeling good, until I noticed something near the riverbank. Footprints again. Bare feet, small and wide, pressed into the mud. I stared at them for a long time, feeling that same unease crawl back into my chest. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. Maybe a day or two. The strange thing was they led directly toward my campsite. That day, I stayed alert. I didn't go far from the tent. Every sound made me look up, scanning the trees. As the sun set, I built a larger fire and kept it burning strong. I wasn't going to let the dark surround me like last time. But late that night, just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it again. The same sound. Footsteps, slow and careful, circling the tent. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I gripped the hatchet tight and stayed completely still. The steps stopped right behind me, so close I could almost sense the presence through the thin fabric. And then I smelled it. It was faint, but distinct. A sour, earthy odor, like someone who hadn't bathed in months. The smell of damp dirt and sweat mixed together. I stayed still until the sound faded into the forest. I didn't sleep at all that night. When morning came, I packed up and left again. I never saw whoever it was. I never found out why they were out there or what they wanted. But there's one thing I'll never forget. When I reached my car this time, I checked the back window out of habit. There, in the same spot as before, was another handprint. This time, right beside it, there was something else, pressed faintly into the dirt below the handle. Footprint, bare, small, and smeared like it had slid slightly down the metal. I wiped it away, but the image stayed burned into my mind. I don't go camping alone anymore, not because I stopped loving it, but because I finally accepted that the woods aren't empty the way I thought they were. There are people out there, living quietly, unseen, watching, and sometimes they find you first. I went camping alone that weekend because I needed a break from everything. My head was full of noise from work, deadlines, and city traffic. I wanted quiet. I picked a spot I found online, a remote campground near a lake surrounded by thick pine forest. It wasn't one of those organized camping areas with showers or cabins. It was wild and far away from anyone. I thought it was perfect. I packed my tent, sleeping bag, cooking stove, a week's worth of food, and all the usual gear: compass, flashlight, power bank, knife, rope, first aid kit, and extra batteries. I left early in the morning, driving for hours until the road turned into a dirt trail. The sun was high, and dust floated behind my car as I drove deeper into the forest. The GPS lost signal, but I had the map printed. The last few miles were narrow, with trees bending over the road, almost touching each other. When I finally reached the lake, it was silent except for the soft hum of the wind brushing through the tall pines. The air smelled clean, full of pine sap and cold water. The surface of the lake was flat and dark, like glass. I could see no other tents, no parked cars, nothing. I parked near the edge of the water, found a flat patch of ground, and started setting up my tent. The first evening felt peaceful. I boiled some noodles on my small stove, ate while sitting on a rock, and watched the sun drop behind the trees. When night came, the temperature fell fast. The forest went black, and all I could hear were insects and the slow movement of the lake water touching the shore. I sat there with my flashlight off, staring into the dark, trying to clear my thoughts. It was strange how complete the silence became after the insects stopped. I went to sleep a little after midnight. Sometime in the night, I woke up. There was a sound outside the tent, soft footsteps on the leaves. I stayed still, listening. It wasn't an animal scurrying or a branch snapping from the wind. It was slower, heavier, spaced like human steps. I held my breath. The steps stopped near my tent. I could hear faint breathing. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would shake the fabric. Then, nothing. Just the quiet again. I stayed awake until dawn, not daring to move. When morning came, I unzipped the tent and looked around. There were footprints in the soft dirt, not too deep but clear enough to see. They were from boots, not animal tracks, human. I followed them for a bit, but they faded near the tree line. I told myself it might have been another camper walking around, though I hadn't seen anyone else. I shook it off, tried to eat breakfast, and went for a hike to distract myself. The forest was thick and beautiful. Shafts of sunlight broke through the tall trees. Birds moved between the branches. I hiked for hours, following an old logging trail that seemed abandoned. At one point, I found an old fire pit filled with ashes and rusted cans. It looked like someone had camped there years ago. The place had a strange, heavy feeling, like the air didn't move right. I didn't stay long. When I got back to my campsite, everything was the same except my backpack. It was lying open near the tent. The zippers were undone, and some of my food packets were missing. Nothing else was touched. My wallet, phone, knife, all still there. It was like whoever did it only cared about food. I looked around the forest, trying to spot anyone, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. That night, I built a larger fire and kept it burning. I stayed outside the tent longer, watching the woods. Every rustle made me jump. When I finally lay down, I kept my flashlight in my hand. Sometime after midnight, I heard something again. The sound of soft movement in the trees, maybe 30 feet away. Then a faint metallic clink, like something hitting a can or metal cup. I sat up quietly, listening. The sound stopped again. Morning came gray and cold. I decided I would leave the next day. I wanted one last full day to fish at the lake and enjoy the view, but I felt uneasy. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. By afternoon, I caught 2 small fish, cleaned them, and cooked them on the stove. The air felt different that day, still heavy, like before a storm. Around sunset, I saw something across the lake. On the opposite shore, far away but visible, was a figure standing near the trees. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing the water. I stared for a long time, waiting for them to move, but they didn't. I looked away for a second, and when I looked back, they were gone. When night came, I packed most of my gear to make leaving easier in the morning. I planned to wake early, pack up, and drive out before sunrise. I went into my tent, zipped it up, and lay still, waiting to fall asleep. But sleep never came. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again to that same soft crunching sound outside. Slow steps moving closer. I gripped my flashlight and knife. My throat felt dry. The steps stopped just beside the tent again. This time, I could see a faint shadow through the thin fabric. It was tall, too tall for me to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. Whoever it was just stood there. Then I heard a quiet sound, like breathing or maybe sniffing. It lasted a few seconds, then silence again. I stayed still for nearly an hour, barely moving, barely breathing. Finally, I gathered the courage to unzip the tent just enough to peek outside. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness. No one was there. I checked the ground, the same boot prints, newer, deeper. I didn't sleep after that. I packed my things before sunrise, trying not to make noise. The forest felt wrong that morning, like it was holding its breath. I started the car and began the drive out, glancing in the mirrors every few seconds. After maybe 20 minutes, I saw something on the side of the dirt road. It was a small camp, barely noticeable. A torn tarp hanging between 2 trees, some empty cans, and a pile of ashes. I slowed down. On one of the tree trunks, carved deep into the bark, were several lines of words. The first few were hard to read, but the last one stood out clear. "He watches the lake." That hit me like a weight in the chest. Whoever had been near my camp was living there, watching, maybe waiting. I didn't stop to look further. I pressed the pedal and drove until the trees began to thin out and the dirt turned to gravel, then pavement. When I finally got cell signal again, I stopped and looked at my map. That lake wasn't even marked as an official campground anymore. It had been closed off years ago after several disappearances in that area. No one bothered to update the site I found online. It was an old post that never got taken down. That explained the empty space, the lack of other campers, the old fire pits. Someone had been living out there, maybe a drifter, maybe someone hiding from something. Whoever it was, they were used to the silence and probably didn't like people showing up. I thought about those footsteps, the breathing, the missing food, the shadow standing by my tent. I realized how close I came to something worse. I didn't tell anyone the details when I got home. I just said the trip was quiet, that I got what I needed, peace. But for weeks, I couldn't sleep right. I kept hearing that sound, the slow, steady crunch of footsteps outside my tent, stopping just inches away from me. Months later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched online for recent reports near that lake. There was nothing new, just old mentions of hikers who vanished and a few rumors about someone seen wandering the roads at night near the woods. Every time I think back to that trip, I remember the feeling of being watched, the cold air pressing against the tent walls, and that carved message in the tree. He watches the lake. Simple, but I can't forget it. I don't go camping alone anymore. I still love the woods, but I can't look at them the same way again. Now, whenever I pass by a quiet forest or see a still lake, I think about how silence can hide things. Not ghosts or monsters, real things. People. The kind that survive alone, away from the world, watching anyone who steps too close. I always liked being outdoors, away from noise and people. I worked a lot and rarely took breaks, so when I finally had a week off, I decided to go camping alone. I didn't pick a famous camping site or a park filled with families and RVs. I wanted silence, real silence, the kind you only find deep in the woods. I found an old hiking forum post about a lake somewhere in the northern part of the state. The post was years old, but the photos showed a quiet stretch of forest and a flat clearing near the water. It looked peaceful. That's where I decided to go. I left early in the morning. The road narrowed the deeper I went, and after a while, the pavement ended completely. The last 30 minutes were on a dirt path that looked like no one had used it in months. My car rattled and bounced over rocks and roots, but eventually, I saw a gap in the trees that opened into a wide space. The lake was right there, still and dark, surrounded by tall pines. The air was cool and smelled like damp soil and pine sap. I parked, unloaded my gear, and set up camp near the water. I pitched my tent, built a small fire ring from stones I found nearby, and boiled some water for instant coffee. It was peaceful. The only sounds were the quiet lapping of the water and the occasional rustle of the trees. There was something comforting about being so far away from everyone. I watched the sunlight shift on the lake and felt calm for the first time in months. When night came, the temperature dropped fast. The fire gave a little warmth, but the air was sharp. I sat close to the flames, watching them flicker and stretch. Beyond the light of the fire, everything was pitch black. The forest was alive with small noises, branches creaking, crickets, and distant animal calls that echoed faintly through the trees. It was normal, but still, every sound seemed louder when I was alone. I went to sleep around 10. The ground was uneven, and I kept waking up. Sometime in the night, I thought I heard something heavy moving through the brush. I held my breath, listening. It wasn't close, but it was steady, slow, deliberate crunches on dry leaves. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a moose. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter and tried to ignore it. In the morning, everything was quiet again. I stepped out of the tent and saw condensation covering everything. My footprints from yesterday were clear in the damp soil, and next to them there were others. They weren't boot prints like mine. They were bare feet, long, narrow, and deep, like someone had been walking close to my campsite during the night. I froze for a while, staring at them. There were at least 3 prints, maybe 4, leading toward the trees. I couldn't think of any reason someone would be out here barefoot. The nearest town was almost 40 miles away, and this place wasn't on any map I had seen. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. I told myself they might be old, maybe from a swimmer who came here long ago. Still, the soil was soft from the night's dew. These looked fresh. I spent the day trying to distract myself. I fished for a bit but caught nothing. I gathered firewood, boiled noodles, and took a short walk along the shore. Every now and then, I thought I heard something in the distance. Not loud, just faint cracks of branches far back in the forest. Could have been wind, but the air felt still. That night, I built the fire larger than before. I kept it burning high and sat closer to it. I didn't go inside the tent right away. Instead, I sat on a log and watched the treeline. The shadows between the trunks seemed darker than usual. I tried not to let my imagination take over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left the fire burning low outside. I zipped up the flap and lay listening. Hours passed before I started to drift off. Then I heard it again, the same steady movement through the leaves. But this time it was closer, much closer. It circled slowly. I could tell from the pattern of the sound. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. Whatever it was moving carefully. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I didn't move. I just listened. Then something brushed the side of my tent. Not hard, just the soft drag of a hand or branch. The fabric rippled slightly. I wanted to believe it was a branch swaying in the wind, but there was no wind. I stayed still for a long time, barely breathing. Eventually, the noise faded. I didn't sleep again. When daylight came, I unzipped the tent and looked around. The fire was out, and there were more prints around my campsite. Barefoot again, some smaller, some larger. They circled my tent in wide loops. I checked my food supplies and gear. Nothing was missing, but my pack had been unzipped. I thought about leaving right then, but curiosity kept me there. I wanted to know who or what was coming around at night. I decided I'd stay one more day, but stay alert. I found a higher spot near a rocky ridge that overlooked the camp and decided to move my gear there before sunset. The ridge was only a few minutes' climb and had a better view of the lake. It also gave me some distance from the woods behind me. I built another fire and kept my flashlight close. When the sun went down, I sat in the dark and waited. It didn't take long. Around midnight, I saw a faint movement below, near where my tent had been earlier. I turned off my flashlight and crouched low. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I saw it stand. A shape, a person or something close to one, walking slowly around the clearing. They were barefoot just like the prints. I could see the pale reflection of their skin in the moonlight. The figure moved strangely, like someone unsteady or injured. It stopped where my fire pit had been, crouched down, and seemed to touch the ashes. Then it lifted its head and looked straight toward the ridge. I ducked instantly, my chest tightening. I stayed still for what felt like forever. When I finally looked again, it was gone. I didn't hear it walk away. I packed everything before sunrise and decided to leave. As I walked to my car, I kept checking behind me. The woods were silent again, but I couldn't shake the thought of those prints, the way that figure had moved, and how it had found my tent both nights. When I reached the dirt road, I felt relief, until I saw something nailed to a tree beside where I had parked. It was a small piece of wood, roughly cut, with something carved into it. The letters were uneven but readable. It said, "Stay quiet." I didn't stop to look at it longer. I got in the car, locked the doors, and drove until I reached the main highway. I didn't even stop for gas until I was back in town. That night, when I got home, I unpacked my gear in the garage. Everything was there except one thing, my old pocket knife. I knew I had used it to cut twine the night before I moved camp. I didn't remember leaving it anywhere. I didn't go back for it. Weeks later, I was scrolling through hiking posts online again, trying to figure out what that place had been. I found an old comment thread under a post about the same lake. A user had mentioned that years ago, people used to live near that area, small, isolated families that stayed off-grid. The comment said they'd been forced to move after a series of disappearances in the late 90s. No official details, just rumors of squatters who refused to leave when authorities came through. The comment ended with one line, asterisk, "If you find the lake, don't camp there. They don't like noise." Asterisk. It's been months since then. I haven't gone camping again. I still think about that figure sometimes, how it walked barefoot through the woods, how it stopped at my fire, how it looked up toward where I hid. And sometimes when I'm home late at night with the window open, I think I hear that same slow, deliberate sound of footsteps outside, crunch, pause, crunch, like someone testing each step on soft ground, making sure not to be heard. I don't look outside anymore. I just stay quiet. It started as a random idea, a quick camping trip before the summer ended. I had been working nonstop for weeks, barely sleeping, constantly buried under deadlines and screens. One Friday afternoon, I decided I'd had enough. I threw some clothes, a sleeping bag, a tent, and a few cans of food into my car and started driving without any real destination in mind. I wanted somewhere quiet, far from people, where I could breathe and maybe just exist for a while. After about 3 hours of driving through back roads and small mountain towns, I found a dirt road that led deep into a forest. There was no signpost, no indication that it was a campground, but the place looked untouched. Dense pine trees, faint sunlight seeping through thick branches, and that earthy smell that only comes from untouched woods. felt perfect. I followed that dirt path for nearly 20 minutes until it opened into a small clearing beside a narrow river. The water was calm, just a gentle current moving between mossy rocks. The ground was level and soft with fallen pine needles. It seemed like no one had camped there in years. I parked my car on the edge, unpacked, and set up my tent facing the river. The air was cool, and the only sounds were rustling leaves and the occasional splash of water when a fish jumped. Felt peaceful, exactly what I had been craving. I spent the first hour just sitting there, watching the trees move slightly in the wind. When the sun started to drop, I collected some dry branches and built a fire. The orange glow spread across the clearing as night slowly settled in. I made myself a can of soup, ate it right out of the tin, and leaned back against my backpack. The stars started showing one by one. I hadn't seen a sky that clear in years. No city lights, no sounds of traffic, just stillness. But something about the silence didn't feel right after a while. The forest had gone too quiet. No crickets, no frogs, not even the faint hum of insects. I noticed it suddenly. One moment the woods were alive, and the next they felt dead. It wasn't just silence. It was like the forest was holding its breath. I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe the temperature drop had something to do with it. Still, a strange unease crawled up my back. I stayed awake longer than I planned, feeding small pieces of wood into the fire. Around midnight, I finally crawled into my tent. The nylon rustled under my hands as I zipped it shut. I lay there, staring at the dim orange flicker through the fabric from the dying fire outside. I told myself I'd sleep soon, but my mind kept wandering. Sometime later, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know what time it was, but it was still pitch dark. The fire had burned out completely. My tent was silent except for my heartbeat. I lay still, unsure what had woken me. Then I heard it, faint footsteps outside. Slow, careful, like someone trying not to make noise. It wasn't an animal. Animals move differently. These were heavy but measured steps, breaking twigs every now and then. They circled the tent slowly, pausing every few seconds. I froze completely, barely breathing. My first thought was that maybe a hunter had wandered in, but why would someone be walking around in the dark with no flashlight, no sound, just pacing around my tent? The steps stopped for a long time. I couldn't tell where they were anymore. The air inside the tent felt thick. Then I heard the faint crunch again, but this time, it came from right near my car. I wanted to unzip the tent, but fear glued me in place. I listened carefully. Something brushed against the metal of the car, a faint scrape like fingers dragging across it. Then another sound, a dull thud, like something knocking softly on the hood. Minutes passed, or maybe it was an hour, I couldn't tell. The noise eventually stopped, and the woods went silent again. I stayed awake until dawn, eyes open, waiting for daylight. When morning finally came, I stepped out slowly. The air was crisp, and sunlight spilled across the trees. I looked around. Everything seemed normal at first, but then I saw my car. There were muddy handprints on the driver's side window. Not full, clear prints, just streaks where something had pressed and slid down. I checked around the car, found faint footprints in the dirt, but they were messy and uneven. I felt a chill move through me. I tried to convince myself it was just someone passing by, maybe lost, maybe curious. But the forest was dense, and that dirt road was practically invisible from the main highway. It didn't make sense that anyone would just stumble upon me. Still, I told myself not to overthink it. I made some instant coffee, packed my gear, and decided to stay one more night. I figured I was just paranoid from being alone. The day went by calmly. I went for a short walk along the river, followed it upstream for a bit, and found nothing but rocks and fallen trees. The stillness was both beautiful and unnerving. When I returned, I noticed something strange. My tent flap was unzipped. I was sure I had closed it. I checked inside, and though nothing was missing, my backpack was moved slightly. I stood there staring at it for a while, trying to make sense of it. That night, I built a bigger fire. I didn't want to sleep early. The forest around me looked endless in the dark, like it swallowed everything beyond the light. I sat close to the flames, eyes darting at every rustle. The sound of the river had become oddly loud, masking smaller noises from the trees. Sometime past midnight, I heard that same crunch again. Slow footsteps on the edge of the clearing. My chest tightened instantly. The fire was burning bright, and I stared into the darkness, trying to see movement. Nothing, just shadows between trees. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. The beam shook slightly in my hand. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something. A shape, maybe a person, crouched low behind a tree. But the light flickered, and when I aimed again, there was nothing. The noise stopped once more, and all I could hear was my breathing. I decided to keep the fire going all night. When the morning came, I felt exhausted. My eyes stung from staying awake. I packed everything quickly, ready to leave. As I loaded the car, I noticed something in the dirt near the back tires. Fresh footprints again, but this time they led away from the clearing, down toward the river. I followed them for a short distance, and then they just stopped, like whoever made them walked straight into the water. I drove out of there fast, heart racing, glancing in the rearview mirror the whole time. The forest road looked endless, like it didn't want to let me leave. When I finally hit the highway, I felt relief, but a strange curiosity lingered. That night, when I got home, I decided to check the dashcam footage. I usually keep it running for road trips. The memory card was nearly full, but there was something recorded from the night before. I played it back, and my stomach tightened as I watched. The camera faced the front of my car, catching only what was in front of the hood. Around 2:47 a.m., a faint figure appeared at the edge of the firelight. It was a man, tall, thin, with messy clothes that looked torn. He walked slowly toward the tent. For nearly 2 minutes, he just stood there, facing the tent silently. Then he moved to the car, pressed his hands against the window, and leaned forward slightly as if looking inside. The video was grainy, but even through that blur, I could tell he wasn't lost or drunk. His movements were deliberate, calm, almost methodical. After a while, he stepped back, turned his head toward the forest, and disappeared into the darkness. The footage ended there. I sat staring at the screen for a long time. There was no sound, no expression on his face, no sign of confusion or panic, just stillness. I didn't sleep that night, and I haven't gone camping alone since. Sometimes I still wonder who that man was. If he lived somewhere deep in those woods, far from anyone, or if he just wandered, watching people who accidentally found their way into his territory. But what keeps me awake at night isn't what I saw on the camera. It's knowing that if I hadn't woken up that first night, if I hadn't locked myself inside that tent, maybe he would have done more than just watch. I went camping alone in the mountains last summer, something I'd always wanted to do but never had the time or courage for before. I wasn't new to camping, but this trip was different. I wanted to be completely cut off. No friends, no phone signal, no one around for miles. Just me, the forest, and silence. I packed everything carefully. A small tent, a sleeping bag, a headlamp, extra batteries, a first aid kit, some canned food, a camping stove, and a knife. I made sure to double-check every item before loading my backpack. It was heavy, but I didn't want to be missing something important once I was deep in the woods. The trail I chose wasn't one of those popular, well-marked ones. It was an old forestry route that I'd found through a hiking forum. According to a few old posts, it led to a hidden clearing near a small stream, surrounded by thick pine trees. Hardly anyone went there anymore since the park stopped maintaining that side of the forest. That made it perfect for what I wanted: peace, quiet, and no people. The first day went smoothly. I parked my car at the edge of the forest, locked it, and started walking just as the sun was rising. The air was cool, the smell of damp soil and pine strong enough to feel almost sharp in my lungs. The ground was covered in needles and twigs, and every step made a muffled crunch. Birds chirped somewhere high above, and every now and then I'd hear the faint rush of wind moving through the branches. I followed the trail for hours. Around noon, I took a break by a fallen log, drank some water, and ate a protein bar. I checked my GPS just to confirm my location, After that, I turned it off to save battery. By late afternoon, I reached the clearing I'd been aiming for. It was exactly as described. A flat patch of ground beside a narrow stream, surrounded by tall trees on all sides. The sound of running water was constant, soft, and steady, mixing perfectly with the quiet rustle of leaves. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, facing the stream. The ground was firm, the air clean, and the place felt untouched. No footprints, no trash, no signs that anyone had been there in a long time. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. After setting up, I gathered some dry wood and lit a small fire. As the sun started to go down, I cooked some canned soup and ate while watching the light fade through the trees. Everything felt perfect. I remember thinking that this was exactly what I needed, a break from the constant noise and rush of daily life. I stayed up for a while, just listening to the stream and watching the fire crackle, before finally crawling into my tent and falling asleep. That first night, I woke up sometime after midnight. It wasn't any sound that woke me, just a strange feeling, like something wasn't right. My tent was dark except for a faint glow from the dying fire outside. I lay still, listening. The forest was silent. Not quiet, silent. No wind, no insects, no movement. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just the forest settling down, and went back to sleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. The sun was up, birds were back, and the forest felt alive. I made coffee on my small stove and ate breakfast by the stream. I spent most of the day exploring the area, just walking around, taking pictures, and enjoying the calm. I followed the stream upstream for about an hour, then came back to camp by late afternoon. Nothing strange happened that day, but when evening came, that uneasy feeling returned. I couldn't explain it. It was like the forest was watching me. Every now and then I'd think I saw something move far between the trees, but when I looked properly, there was nothing. I told myself it was just shadows or maybe animals, though I didn't hear or see any tracks. That night I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing faint noises, soft thuds, twigs snapping in the distance, leaves rustling even though there was no wind. It didn't sound close, but it also didn't sound like normal forest sounds. Around 3 a.m., I finally dozed off again. When I woke up at dawn, I noticed something odd outside my tent. Near the edge of the clearing, the ground looked disturbed, like someone had walked there recently. The footprints were faint, maybe a day old, maybe less, but they weren't mine. The shoe size looked smaller, lighter. I felt a chill, but I tried to think rationally. Maybe it was some hiker who passed by without me noticing. But that didn't make sense. This place wasn't on any active trail, and I hadn't heard anyone at all. I brushed it off and spent the next day close to camp. I didn't wander too far, just gathered firewood, cleaned up the area, and tried to relax. But that sense of being watched wouldn't leave. Sometimes I'd catch myself turning around suddenly, sure that someone was standing behind me. Nothing, just trees and shadows. Even the stream's constant sound started to feel unnerving, like it was covering up other noises. When night came again, I made sure to keep the fire going brighter than before. I sat close to it, trying to ignore the darkness just outside the light's edge. My tent was right behind me, zipped and ready, but I didn't feel like sleeping yet. Around midnight, I heard something again. It wasn't an animal sound. It was faint, irregular movement, like someone stepping on dry twigs slowly, trying not to make noise. It came from the trees across the stream. My heartbeat sped up. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam just bounced off the trees. Nothing, just empty woods. After a few minutes, the noise stopped. I waited, my hand tight around the flashlight, my other hand gripping the handle of my knife. The forest was silent again. I sat there for hours, not moving, until the first light of dawn started to show. I didn't sleep that night. When the sun came up, I checked the area across the stream. The ground was soft there, damp with mud. I found footprints again. This time they were fresh, so fresh that water was still seeping into the impressions. There was no mistaking it. Someone had been standing there watching my camp during the night. The footprints went deeper into the trees and then disappeared into thicker brush. I thought about leaving right then, but I was already far from the trail, and it would take me nearly half a day to hike back to the car. I decided to stay one more night, keep my fire big, and pack early in the morning to leave. I spent the entire day on edge, checking my surroundings every few minutes. The feeling that I wasn't alone grew stronger with every hour. The forest felt different now, like it was closing in on me. The air was heavy, quiet again. No birds, no insects, nothing. By the time the sun went down, I'd already packed most of my things. I kept only what I needed for the night: sleeping bag, flashlight, and food. I sat beside the fire, trying to stay calm. The sound of burning would fill the silence. Around 10 p.m., I heard movement again. This time it was closer, not across the stream on my side. The firelight reached only so far, and beyond that, the forest was pitch black. I could hear faint crunching, the sound of something stepping slowly, carefully, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. I aimed my flashlight toward it, but again, there was nothing visible. Still, the sound continued. I couldn't tell how many footsteps there were. Maybe one person, maybe more. I stayed awake the entire night. The sounds came and went, always distant enough that I couldn't see anything. I didn't sleep, didn't close my eyes. I waited for the sun like it was the only thing that could save me. When morning came, I tore down the tent, packed everything as fast as I could, and started hiking back to my car. I didn't eat, didn't stop for water. I just walked. The forest felt wrong now. Every sound, every rustle made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. At one point, maybe 2 hours into the hike, I noticed something through the trees, something that stopped me cold. About 20 feet away, leaning against a tree, was a small piece of cloth. It looked like part of a jacket sleeve, torn and faded, but it wasn't mine. I walked closer and saw that it was attached to a tree branch with a bit of rope, hanging there like a marker. Below it, on the ground, were more footprints. They weren't there when I passed this way coming in. Whoever had been near my camp had been following my route. My heart was pounding. I turned and kept walking faster. I didn't stop again. Felt like the forest was endless. My pack felt twice as heavy, my legs burned, but I didn't slow down. The only thought in my head was to reach the car. When I finally saw it through the trees, a wave of relief hit me so strong I nearly fell to my knees. The car was exactly where I'd left it, untouched. But something was off. There were faint marks on the dirt near the driver's door. Footprints again, smaller than mine, circling the car once. I unlocked the door, threw my backpack inside, and started the engine immediately. I didn't look around. I just drove. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest small town about 30 miles away. I pulled into a gas station and just sat there. I went camping alone that summer because I needed to clear my head. Work had been stressful, and my mind felt cluttered with everything happening around me. I wanted to be somewhere quiet, away from people, phones, and traffic. I'd always liked camping, but this time I wanted something more remote, somewhere far enough that I wouldn't hear another human voice for days. I spent a week planning the trip, studying topographic maps, reading old hiking blogs, and marking out an isolated spot beside a small lake deep in the national forest. It was about 15 miles off the nearest service road, hidden among pine ridges and rock fields. It sounded perfect. The day I left, the weather was clear, warm enough for comfort but not too hot. My backpack was heavier than usual because I brought everything for a long solo stay. Tent, sleeping bag, water filter, stove, food for 5 days, knife, and a small first aid kit. I parked my car at the trailhead around noon and started hiking in. The trail quickly narrowed as I moved deeper into the forest. The air changed too. It grew still and heavy, filled with the resin smell of pine and damp earth. I could hear the crunch of my boots and the faint whistle of wind high above the trees, but otherwise, it was silent. After several miles, I stopped for a short break on a rocky slope. I could see the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. No cabins or trails or signs of people. It made me feel small but calm at the same time. I ate a snack, drank water, and kept walking. The hike took nearly 6 hours before I reached the lake, just as the sun started dipping behind the trees. The lake was smaller than I expected, more like a large pond, but it was beautiful. The water reflected the fading orange sky, and there was a small clearing perfect for a tent. I set up camp there, facing the water. That first night was peaceful. I cooked some instant noodles on my stove, watched the moon rise, and listened to frogs croaking somewhere across the lake. The forest felt alive, but not threatening. I slept deeply that night, probably more soundly than I had in months. The next morning, I woke up early, made coffee, and explored around the lake. I found deer tracks near the water and an old fire pit filled with moss, maybe left behind by hunters years ago. The air was crisp, and I felt completely alone in the best way. By the third day, though, something felt slightly off. I couldn't explain it at first. It wasn't noise or weather. It was a feeling, something subtle. When I walked in the woods, I started to notice how quiet it got when I stopped moving. Normally, you can hear birds, insects, or wind, but sometimes the forest would just fall completely silent for a few seconds. Even the frogs stopped at night occasionally, as if something passed nearby. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking because I was alone. Still, the silence felt strange. That afternoon, I went fishing on the far side of the lake. It was a wide, rocky stretch with a clear view of my camp across the water. While I was there, I noticed something odd on the ground, boot prints. At first, I thought they were mine, but they were much larger and deeper. They led from the woods to the shoreline and stopped just a few feet from where I stood. They weren't old either. The edges were sharp and undisturbed. I followed them for a bit, but lost them near the trees. It bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I had hiked 15 miles off the main trail. Nobody should have been out here. I went back to camp before sunset and checked my gear. Everything was where I left it, but I still felt uneasy. That night, I couldn't sleep as well. I kept waking up, listening to faint sounds outside my tent. Once, I heard what sounded like slow footsteps near the trees, but when I sat up and listened closely, it stopped. I stayed still for a long time, staring at the tent fabric in the dim light, waiting for something else. Eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach tighten. Across the lake, on the same side where I found the footprints, a small pile of rocks had been stacked in a straight, deliberate tower. It wasn't there before. It looked too neat to be natural. I tried to think logically. It could have been some old marker, or maybe I just hadn't noticed it earlier. Still, it bothered me so much that I packed up my stove and spent most of the day hiking around the lake to check it out. When I got there, I saw more than just the stacked stones. A small patch of ground near the edge of the trees had been disturbed, as if someone had dug there recently. The soil was loose and dark. I didn't want to dig it open to find out what it was. I backed away and returned to camp faster than I meant to, every sound behind me making my pulse jump. I didn't feel safe anymore, but I didn't want to hike out that late in the day. I decided I'd leave first thing in the morning. That night was the worst. The wind picked up, and the temperature dropped sharply. I could hear branches creaking, but under that sound, I thought I heard movement, soft, deliberate steps moving through the trees. I kept telling myself it was just animals, but it didn't sound like any animal I knew. The steps were too slow, too controlled, and they circled around the tent at a distance. I stayed completely still, clutching the handle of my knife, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Hours passed like that, the noises coming and going, until everything went silent again. I didn't sleep at all. When dawn finally came, I packed up fast. I didn't even eat breakfast. I wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. I took one last look at the lake and noticed something that froze me where I stood. Near the spot where I'd found the disturbed ground, there were now 2 more piles of rocks, each one about knee-high, spaced evenly apart. I didn't know what they meant, and I didn't want to. I just left. The hike back was long and miserable. The forest felt different, darker, heavier. I kept glancing behind me, sure I was being followed, though I never saw anyone. Once, I thought I heard someone whistling far off, a faint tune that rose and fell with the wind. But when I stopped, it vanished completely. The trail felt longer than before, every mile stretching endlessly. By the time I reached my car, the sun was already setting. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the door. I didn't stop to rest until I'd driven 30 miles away from that forest. When I finally got home that night, I unpacked everything, trying to shake the whole experience from my mind. My gear was all accounted for except for one thing. My small camping shovel, which I'd kept strapped to my pack, was missing. I didn't remember using it after the first night, and I couldn't think of when I could have dropped it. That detail didn't seem like much at first, but it stuck with me. It made me wonder if someone had taken it from my camp while I slept. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched online for any mention of that area of the forest. I found an old hiking forum thread from years ago, where someone mentioned hearing about strange setups near that same lake. Rock stacks, dug-up patches, missing gear. Some even claimed to have seen human tracks leading into the woods but never back out. Most people brushed it off as local stories, maybe hunters marking spots, but nobody seemed to know for sure. The posts ended abruptly after a few comments, and the account that made them hadn't been active since. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints, the rock piles, and that disturbed soil. I tried to convince myself it was all a coincidence. Maybe some survivalist practicing skills, maybe old forest markings, maybe just my nerves after too much isolation. But the image of those freshly dug patches kept returning to me. The spacing of the rocks looked deliberate, almost like markers. I kept imagining what might have been buried there, or who might have buried it. I didn't tell anyone about the trip. I just stopped going camping after that. The peace I used to feel in the woods never came back. Every time I think about returning, I picture that silent forest, the prints by the water, the sound of steps circling my tent, and the missing shovel. I can't shake the thought that someone, or something entirely human, was out there watching me the whole time. And maybe they're still there waiting for the next person who thinks they're camping alone.